All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I got a couple of interesting gentlemen from the World War Now podcast, Conrad and Dmitriy. How you guys doing today?
Doing great, Patrick. Great to be here. Long-time viewer of the channel, so it's an honor.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Dmitriy, how are you, bro?
Amazing, brother. Thank you for having us on. It's the collab I think everyone's been waiting for, at least myself and Conrad. And yeah, I can't wait. Your content has been fire lately. I'm down to have a good talk.
Excellent. I'm excited for today's conversation as well, because the content that you guys cover, and for everybody listening that may not be familiar with your guys' podcast, their Substack link is in the video description, and their hyperlink is in the video title. So make sure you guys click that and go give our brothers some subs over on YouTube and follow their Substack. I want you guys to kind of introduce your podcast, how it got started, and why you guys are so interested in this. But for those who aren't aware, obviously I personally have been diving more and more into some of the recent prophecies of saints and elders and how it relates to the eschaton, end times, the Great World War. And you guys have been covering this really from a sort of news, contemporary news articles and geopolitics and stuff like that. Can you guys explain your podcast and how it came about?
Totally, yeah. So I work as I was already working as a journalist somewhat in the political world, conservative, nationalist politics, and I saw everything going on, and I had been received into the church. We were talking about this off air, Patrick, when they're right at the beginning of COVID and when all of that started. So actually the words of Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu were sort of, I kind of always viewed them as like literal, we know the channel, but patristic nectar, I guess, like during that time, because he was talking about all of these things. He was celebrating, the feasts of theophany, despite authorities, threatening to arrest him and all of these things. So I was like, this guy has something to say. This guy is, standing up for the truth. And I wasn't able to go to church, but I was able to, listen to his sermons and whatnot. And so he started talking about St. Paisios, and I started looking into all these prophecies that he had talked about. And I was like, I think there's something to this. And I used to run a newsletter called the American Byzantine. And during that, I really covered the Donbass War in 2018 and 2019, well before anybody was talking about it in the news, before 2022, of course, when that invasion started. And so I'd already had all of this context. I had heard about saints talking about that even before the war started. There was prophecies. I was really invested in the schism because I was basically studying religious journalism in college, and then this whole thing was happening in Ukraine, which I was converting to Orthodoxy. So it was all very fascinating. I had some articles published in these different religious journals and gotten all these fights with these journalists that thought they're like, you're trying to source Russian propaganda and all this kind of garbage. But that connects to the recent Texas Monthly article. Maybe we could talk about that. But basically all of this was happening, and then the war started, and I did a few streams on other Orthodox people's channels, people that, maybe they weren't focused on geopolitics, but they're like, this is so relevant to Orthodoxy, I should have someone on to talk about it. And they were like, this Conrad guy kind of knows what he's talking about. So I talked about it, and then the war goes on, and then the Nord Stream pipelines got blown up. And we were like, all right, there's just no way where anyone's getting out of this anytime soon. So a few months before that, I'd done this big thread on Twitter that got kind of popular about why I thought the prophecies were kind of imminent and being fulfilled, and showing what Metropolitan Neophytos said, showing like literal timestamps on when his videos had been posted, then certain things happened, these kinds of things. And then just examining it through the lens of rising multipolarity. And I'm like, I think this needs to be a whole podcast brand show, this needs to be a whole thing.
Wow.
So I messaged Dmitriy. He had like a Twitter account that had a few thousand followers, and I was like, hey man, about Russia, you can speak Russian, that would be really helpful, let's start a show. And he was like, sounds great. we'd known each other through like Jay Dyer's Discord and all sorts of things sort of in the past.
Right.
And, you know, he's a cradle, I'm a convert. So it's a good perspective on that kind of thing. And, you know, he's Russian, I'm American. So I was like, this is kind of a good dynamic we have going here. And ever since then, we've been discussing basically every week. We've missed almost no weeks. We've discussed, so this is since September, October 2022. We've discussed the weekly news and what we believe is the ongoing Third World War through the lens of Orthodox Christian prophecy and I guess you could say nationalistic perspectives. I guess, you know, that's the political side. And then the Orthodox prophecy is pretty much the worldview lens that we're narrowing things down through. And I would say, Patrick, your channel is probably one of the only other channels that, while you're not focusing just on geopolitics and news, like you're like that worldview perspective and then applying the prophecies. So I think I think your audience, I do not to shill myself again, but I think the audience would enjoy.
Well, I appreciate that. No, I think the people who like my geopolitical stuff, and really there's just a handful of topics that I like to cover, and the ongoing geopolitical stuff from an Orthodox perspective. For me, and I'm curious about you guys, Dmitry may be a little bit different because he is cradle, but for me, one of the biggest transitions becoming Orthodox, first viewing everything through an Orthodox theological lens, but then once it gets into politics, seeing how world history really does revolve around Jerusalem and Constantinople, and then seeing, you know, the fall of the Soviet Union, as which some elders believe was the beginning of the end times. We can get into thoughts about that and the spread of the sort of satanic ideology of communism. But the bombing of Serbia, you know, the attack on indigenous Christians in Iraq through the U.S. military, Ukraine, Russia, Palestine, Israel, all this stuff. Once you're Orthodox, it's like, damn, all these dots are beginning to connect. And it's like, you can see politics from, I believe, obviously as Orthodox, from like the more accurate historical perspective of what's going on, because what undergirds all of reality is the spiritual warfare, the powers that are unseen. So, you know, and today that, or at least in the last couple of days, Putin or Russia has offered a ceasefire in Ukraine, of which we know that the West is going to reject. They've already essentially have. And that NATO released the plan for U.S. troops to be on the front lines. I covered a little bit about that. So, you know, take it away wherever you guys want to go in regards to the current World War III, or maybe if you want to talk about wherever you guys want to start this conversation, Orthodox Christianity and geopolitics, feel free.
Yeah, you say Jerusalem, Constantinople, then you become Orthodox and really dig into it, and you learn it all goes back to Cyprus. That's where it all, you know, I joke really, but me and Dmitry have been joking, and not even joking, but now seriously talking about sometime next year going to Cyprus and doing stuff there and doing some on the ground, basically some journalism. But
right,
I guess I'll let Dmitry talk after I make this first announcement. I know I've been yapping, but I would say probably one of the more unique things that we bring to the geopolitical analysis is right now everyone's talking about Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, China, Taiwan.
Right.
And I wouldn't be saying anything new if I came on here and said, these are the three fronts of the ongoing Third World War. And then when we look back, you'll look at this era in time as clearly after it had already started. A lot of other people are saying that. I think I was saying it pretty early in like early 2022 before other people were, but that's kind of a point that has been pretty much, I think, established at this point. But
right.
What the angle that we bring, specific like geopolitics, you know, not just the orthodoxy and the prophecies, which we're going to get into in depth, but the reality of the future Turkish-Russian clash, we think is very easy. If you look into deep geopolitics, like real politics, like you actually really look into like specific diplomats, who's being appointed, like in specifically between Turkey, Azerbaijan, Israel, and Russia. This is an extremely and Ukraine ultimately. This is an extremely crucial current alliance corridor being that is, I think, something that most people that are commenting on this war, you know, most of these multipolar alt media conflict people, they get too caught up in a like, oh, Russia's allying with the Muslims. Oh, you know, these kinds of what I would consider kind of pop infotainment, like low IQ understanding of what's really going on in the world. But you look at what's going on, and in some capacity, the Russian government is moving closer with the Turcosphere. In other capacities, they're dramatically becoming opposed in certain geopolitical interests and on certain fronts. And that was something that I had been noticing before I even started the show, that Russian proxies were clashing in places like Syria, Libya, Cyprus, ostensibly when Russia used to be closer with the Greeks. But at the same time, because Turkey has been basically the most powerful NATO power that has kind of refrained from commenting on a lot of the Ukraine stuff, they grew closer together. And then this ties into Armenia, Azerbaijan, which Armenia was a historic closer ally of Russia, but now they've basically done an about face. So all of these things come together. I think that's probably, when it specifically comes to us commenting on the ground news, we're going to be the only people that I'm aware of that are bringing this perpetual kind of what I consider a slow-moving catastrophe that's going to evolve between the Russians and the Turks. And by the Turks, I mean that's Armenia, Azerbaijan, could mean any number of other Central Asian countries that kind of encompass that world of things. But yeah, that's sort of the angle we're bringing to the table. But Dmitry provides a great perspective as somebody who knew so much about these Russian prophecies before. Again, he'd be posting about these prophecies if I had never even asked him to start this show. So it was a perfect get together.
Well,
yes, in a way.
Go ahead, Dmitry. Go ahead, brother.
Sorry. No, it was just an organic collaboration, and I think as an Orthodox Christian, you will notice that, unfortunately, having at least a sort of a very surface level knowledge of geopolitics is simply unavoidable in today's world, because you begin to, I mean, you guys mentioned how you came into the church, had your catechesis during the COVID pandemic, which must have been absolutely insane. And not just because of the pandemic itself, but because of the geopolitical tensions which began towards the end of the Trump presidency under Mike Pompeo, the schism between the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and I mean, you needed to actually point towards Istanbul on a map, and the average American, I'm not sure if they could do that specifically, not saying you guys couldn't, but an average Orthodox Christian would need to learn about all these ancient patriarchates and jurisdictions, and you know, that's really complicated stuff. So, and of course, tie all of that into 2014, the Ukrainian church. Why is this, you know, piece of land allegedly politically separate today? Why is it sovereign? Who announced its sovereignty? Which saints spoke about Ukrainian sovereignty? You know, the hint is none. But you know, you kind of get into this conversation, and I think we're just unfortunately bound to at least know something about the political. And so I think the podcast does provide like that additional perspective. If people want to go deeper without, say, being marred in misinformation and disinformation, which is actively being thrown out there on the internet. And being Cradle, of course, gives me a certain foundation, but I've seen, I mean, I think we've all seen many Cradle Orthodox Christians, both Russians, Greeks, coming from, you know, maybe even a good faith background, but they were simply deluded into taking one or the other side very strongly. And of course, their perspective is morphed by that. And I try to avoid that, of course, personally. And Conrad's there to kind of, you know, anchor me down sometimes to reality. So it's really good.
Well, do you guys want to, because again, from the prophecies, and you've already hit on the relationship between Russia and Turkey, you know, I think it's St. Paisios that mentioned as soon as the Bosphorus Strait is closed, which we can talk it again, we can begin anywhere in regards to the stepping down or the potential assassination or sickness of Erdogan and the rising of a new power in Turkey. But the relationship between Turkey and Russia is really pivotal for Orthodox Christians to view current geopolitical circumstances from light of the wisdom of our elders and our saints. Do you guys want to begin there and talk a little bit about, you know, the current status? You've already mentioned that Russia's kind of pulling away in certain ways, and at the same time giving lip service that they support Erdogan. And according to some of the prophecies, the more Muslim supportive side of the Turks are going to actually have a sort of sympathetic relationship with Russia once the war actually breaks out, and the more secular Western NATO, American-controlled, Western-controlled people within the Turkish government, they're going to essentially ascend to power. And this is going to be one of the reasons why the West will have dominion over Turkey, closing the Bosphorus Straits, and why Russia, according to some, that they're going to, whatever happens to Turkey, I think this is Metropolitan Neophytos, whatever happened to Ukraine, Russia's going to do to Turkey 10 times.
Yeah, the prophecies also say that it'll be like the Russians and the Turks will go from friends to enemies like overnight, basically. Like it'll be like, oh, basically, I think it'd be something similar to the current status quo, basically, and then we're going to basically be a bit caught off guard with how quickly things turn the other direction because it makes sense, even outside of the fact that it's relevant because of the Greek and Russia, like Turkey is this like literal bridge between Russia and the Greek world. It makes sense that this would be kind of a focus of what Orthodox elders are talking about. But Turkey is also the second most powerful NATO military. It's always been used as this southern front for NATO in the West to have nukes or missiles pointed at what used to be the Soviet Union. So it's extremely relevant in that regard. And yeah, you mentioned that it's going to perhaps be the Muslims, maybe the people that currently support Erdogan, that are going to be sympathetic to Russia because, as the prophecies say, it's going to be when the Kemalists come back into power, which in the previous election, that was Kılıçdaroğlu, who was the candidate against Erdogan, who got way closer in the election than anybody would have perhaps expected. That's why we did a live stream with that election. We had our friend David on to cover it from Turkey. We were doing all this stuff because we thought this could be might be what starts this thing. Because if Erdogan goes, then these people are obviously just going to start towing the NATO line because they're going to be on a much weaker front because they haven't been in power, building a power base, doing what we consider were those self coups by Erdogan in the past 10 years, where he's, really shored up sort of absolute power. People compare him to Putin, and on the one hand, that's sort of propaganda as making him this sort of part of the bloc of the, authoritarian non-Western rulers. But it is true, he's taken Turkey into this much more powerful position than it was in through a sort of more autocratic using of power. So that's not entirely a slur. But I think the fact that the prophecies talk about, there's even getting to the parts where it's like a third of the Turks will die, a third of them will, be pushed into the hinterland, a third will become Orthodox. These are obviously extremely dramatic, and we know based on how many of the saints interpret Revelation that it's not literally going to be 33%. No, we're not going to have it all tallied out, I don't think. But I think the reality of the future. The shift with this geopolitical move where Erdogan passes on, I think it wouldn't be a surprising thing, and this would be sort of one of the other prophetic things that we cover a lot on the show, would be if that coincided with whether it's his retirement or death of Putin himself, because that is something that is just as up in the air, actually more so up in the air, because anybody, even without the prophecies, could maybe say, well, you could wager that the Kemalists would come back into power after Erdogan dies. They're a relevant political faction, but with Putin, it's kind of up in the air. United Russia is pretty much ascendant as far as power making goes, but there's no obvious successor. Lavrov and any of the other super visual people are old. They're not being groomed or anything like that. And of course, you mentioned off air, we had a show recently with Gregory Hears. We've loved your streams with Father Peter. And we talked about St. John Vitatsis, the Marble King, the Sleeping King, who you mentioned on your streams. And there's a prophecy in this book, which I know you mentioned. And this book talks about, I can't remember which prophecy it was from. I believe it was Elder Danyushka of Siberia, who says that basically a new czar will come to Russia from the lands that gave us our faith, and the interpretation meaning Byzantium. And so I've always said, and I was in the past 6 months, I've been to Russia twice, and I've talked to people there that are monarchists, that have spiritual fathers, that have talked about these prophecies, that go to Greece. I have a hand-painted icon from Mount Athos from a Russian who helps finance, these monasteries and whatnot. And the problem is, Russians and Greeks, they're as Americans, as I think everyone on the stream would identify as nationalists in the West. But it's one thing to say you're a nationalist in American when that gets you dirty looks and you can be all brave and be like, yeah, I'm a nationalist. Yeah. And then when you talk to people that are actually nationalists from other countries and they're hard-headed and stubborn about things that are come on, man. I'm wouldn't it make sense if it would be this person? No, we're going to be ruled by a Russian, man. Or you talk to Greeks and they're see this prophecy, and they're no, he's going to rule from Constantinople and Greece. None of this Moscow, Third Rome stuff. And I'm look, I'm reading what these saints say, and it seems to me that the Greeks and the Athenites have it really figured out with some people preserving doctrine and everything, but the Russians have sort of been able to retake Christian governance. Right. And look, Greeks, y'all are legalizing gay marriage. Russians, y'all have some practices that, maybe you could learn more from Mount Athos. These are things that I'm looking at on either side, and it would make sense to me. And again, spoiler alert, I'm just a guy, so don't go to anybody saying that, oh, the prophecies mean this. I'm speculating here on the show. I don't even necessarily do this much speculation, but I think the fact that a future emperor could perhaps arise, maybe from the Greeks, maybe from a more southern Mediterranean place, and then rule from Russia, as Russia itself has sort of asserted itself as this third Rome. That doesn't seem crazy to me when I'm reading different words, again, from both Greek and Russian saints. The fact that there's a consensus patron between these two groups, it proves people often say that, oh, Saint Paisios, these Saint Nectarios, Saint Cosmas of Aetolia, these are national. These are just nationalist sayings for a people that are being oppressed by like their enemy. And it's like, no. Why would the Russian saints be saying the same thing? Why would there be saints in the Holy Land saying the same thing? Why are there Serbian saints saying the same thing? A Russian friend of mine who works really closely with our friend Andrei Afanasiev, who we had on the show, who's a frontline journalist in the Donetsk People's Republic. He goes there all the time. He sent me this prophecy from this Serbian saint that was talking about all this kind of stuff. I'd never even heard of it before. So people need to also recognize that in the English-speaking world, we're still only getting a bit of a glimpse into what I think is the reality here. And at the same time, because these Orthodox countries are, they're nationalistic people, they haven't necessarily been as globalized. They even aren't as in communion with each other. I think that part of our job and part of, as Metropolitan Neophytos said, that the technology of, this is what St. Porphyrios told him, that the technology of the time will be used to spread this word. Maybe it's the job of people in the West to realize that all the different Orthodox fathers, not only were they talking about this, but they all form a web that can help us understand it even better. I think that's something that I think that's real.
No, I totally agree with that. What, from your guys' perspective, because listening to your guys' podcast, you guys, mine's more from a elevated standpoint in regards to theology, philosophy. You guys do a great job of like news articles, things that are happening in the news around the world. What do you think is the most important thing that Americans or people in the West are not aware of due to the propaganda and our own media limiting the perspective on the current geopolitical situation?
I think at the moment it would be the siding of America with both Israel, a very nationalistic country, as well as Ukraine, also a nationalistic country, but one which is falling into this bizarre form of liberalism at the moment. So we see America supporting foreign powers which are very sort of different doctrinally, internally, and also which seemingly shouldn't even work together, because one country is, naturally they have an overabundance of these Banderite, what you could only call neo-Nazis very loosely, running the show. On the other hand, you have, of course, those who allegedly fight against, that group of people in Israel. But you have the American establishment supporting both sides. So that obviously should raise some massive questions in any sort of listener's minds. And I think the average American, if they knew that contradiction, but the reality is, I mean, demons and their servants here on earth are chaotic by their very nature. Like, Patrick, some of your streams about, say, the psychedelic world as well has delved into that. It doesn't, politics, especially when it's conducted by the servants of the Antichrist, can be chaotic in its nature, and it can be confusing. I think that's probably one of its goals, to be honest, especially the way these people are conducting themselves. So when you see a LGBTQ parade going down the street of Kiev, right, in the next week or so, they're planning it, right, like a massive parade show in the month of June of all times. But they're syncing it up. You will see far right wing Ukrainian nationalists walking alongside them, and you will see Joe Biden supporting that. And of course, they'll have swastikas and black suns and all these interesting symbols that the Ukrainians simply have taken upon themselves and now claimed that these symbols belong to them, right? And you'll see them walking alongside rainbow flags, and this will somehow, it's supposed to fit and work together in the minds of the average American consumer who's consumed enough Fox News and CNN. But in reality, that's really not supposed to be the case. So it really shows how brainwashed I think a lot of people have become if they don't react to a contradiction such as that. Or perhaps the parade itself simply won't be shown on the television, similar to how the persecution of the church hasn't been shown. So I think people should be aware that the American establishment, the hegemony of the USA, your taxpayer dollars. And it's hard to say your taxpayer dollars when these people print fiat currency literally out of thin air. So I can't even say, because we don't know, are these printed dollars or are these taxpayer dollars? You can't even tell at this point. But in any case, the American regime is being unfortunately used, the consensus of the American people is being used to spread, I think, chaos around the world in a large capacity, and more so than, say, other countries such as the ones Conrad discussed, Turkey, Azerbaijan, which are also, I would say, not the best actors in, say, on the world stage. But from what we saw, after Mike Pompeo's support of the schism, and of course Joe Biden's support of the current Zelensky regime, and completely closing their eyes on the persecution of the church in Ukraine, and again, at the same time supporting the genocide in Gaza, you really begin to understand that, hold on, this is the swamp that Donald Trump was talking about, but even worse than that. It's not just a swamp, it's a hellish abyss, which I think it's good to shine your light on, see exactly what's down there in the dungeon. And I think we try to do that. Yeah.
And I would say from as an American, because I'm with you in regards all the criticisms you could levy at the American empire, I would stand behind you. But, since Vietnam, going to war has not been popular amongst the American populace, and they've constantly voted in opposition to any war. And so you look at everything from Vietnam forward, and it's just the military industrial complex. And it feels like for this globalist movement, America is just the military arm. And so printing money, moving manufacturing out, collapsing, the way of life of the people who actually live here. And I think that's partly why Trump got into office and why he was popular. And we can, there's certainly plenty of criticisms you can levy at Trump in regards to the effectiveness of him as an actual president. But it's like people don't want the wars, but nobody can stop it. Nobody can stop this war machine of the West. And NATO, all the NATO countries are in lockstep with whatever the United States regime. And it's these bureaucratic, faceless people that are never voted in that you can never vote out. And so it really undermines the whole concept of Western democracy. The rhetoric with saving democracy. We don't have a democracy. What are you talking about? So I think that you're totally right. There's so much propaganda in the West, and the average boomer, it feels like there's a shift amongst millennial and Gen Zs in regard to how they're viewing geopolitics and America's role in relationship to other countries. But people are brainwashed. And even though they don't want war, the same people that had the LGBTQ or the BLM are the same ones that have the Ukraine flag, or the same ones that are promoting, as Dmitry said, the Azov battalion that has explicit, World War, say they go back to certain people's Mean Mr. Small Mustache Man of World War II, and they're claiming everybody's a Nazi, and yet they're literally supporting people who I'd identify as that is exactly what they are. It breaks the brain.
No, I completely agree. And you mentioned the unpopularity of the wars. And you know what else is pretty unpopular, even frankly among left-wing people, is just like the totally open border. Yet somehow the wars keep happening and the border never gets dealt with. And that's why you understand that at a certain level. And again, I'm not saying this is probably the first, I'll say this, of the 3 times that I've been presented with voting for Trump, I voted for him when I was 18 in 2016. I voted for him again in 2020. This is probably the least enthusiastic I've been to vote for him, because putting aside all the vaccine stuff, I'm not sure that the fact that Biden's been in office these past few months hasn't been a good thing as far as the whole Israel thing is concerned. I'm not sure that if Trump wasn't in there, we'd already have gone in with Iran, that we already would have done something in Lebanon. I don't know. Trump has kind of been all over the place on these things. On the one hand, he seems almost willing to call out the Israel lobby on certain things and be transactional with them. But then on the other hand, he'll just, and I think it's proximity to a meeting with Zionist donors, he'll just throw up his hands and totally just say just be like, yeah, the Zionists have to do what they do. And so on the one hand, obviously Biden, his State Department is run by Antony Blinken. It's not like they're doing that much to help the Palestinians, but there's a chance that with the Republicans and Trump, it goes way worse. And it's specifically looking at, you talk about what's something that politically, geopolitically people aren't aware of. Dmitry is right as far as I think adding in the reality of I think if the one thing that people would be aware of, it would help them, is that through the lens of Orthodox spirituality and spiritual warfare, then looking at the powers that be and who is oppressing specific countries, specific regions where certain things being pushed. I think that's sort of the key, I guess you could say. But then when it specifically comes to America, and even more just specifically politics without as much of a religious connection, you need to realize that the reason that those 2 issues, the border and the war specifically, are just, despite being basically bipartisanly disapproved of, are moved forward with is because it's, two sides of like the kosher Zionist sandwich. Like you've got the Republicans and the Zionists on one side that are like, we have to protect Israel, even though, like, if you polled anybody who, after presenting them a basic 5-minute presentation of the facts, you could basically poll anybody and be like, why are we supporting Israel? Like, it would be, I think, a pretty standard agreement. If it wasn't for the whole evangelical Zionist kind of psyop that was going on, I think it'd be a pretty cut and dry thing. But no, as Thomas Massey just said, every single representative has an AIPAC guy. That's just how it goes. And then on the left, you'll even get certain members of them and all these old school Democrats that are like, yes, build the wall. Like, let's just get this over with. They'll even, some of them even are down with restricting legal immigration because of, old union ties and these sorts of things. But it doesn't matter. The immigrants and the H-1Bs, and it just keeps coming because the one side exists to make sure that the political reality secures the homeland of Israel at home. And the other side exists to secure the homeland for the people abroad, which means to create a multicultural, anti-nationalist, anti-Christian society that is basically as far away as you can get from something resembling, like you said, Tiny Mustache Man, something resembling the Russian Empire, something resembling the Roman Empire, these places where the people that currently rule in Israel were, that tribe would feel threatened. The whole purpose of both sides of politics is to kind of, conquer the two main purposes of, solving that problem for them, which is secure a physical, political homeland in somewhere, but then also to make sure that wherever the diaspora may be, they're just not sovereign. That's basically the takeaway of it, is you can't have sovereign nations because they could do something we don't like, really, whatever that is. And so that's sort of the reality that people need to be aware of. And I think you're aware of this, Patrick. There's sort of this dialectic on the right propping up where I think a lot of people and a lot of these Zionist forces in America have sort of allowed people to, what you might say, to do a little bit of a racism, do just a little bit, have a little bit of fun with, with some white boy summer talk, some deportations, we talk about doing that kind of thing, but you have to support Israel. We need to support Israel, and that's how this goes. But it seems that the powers that be realize that with the mass migration in Europe and America and these things, they've got to give a little bit if they want to kind of keep the alliance going at the current status quo. So I think that's something that a lot of people would do well to realize, because I think a lot of psyops, whether it's future literal like terrorist attack, mass events, or just the subtle political machinations of the media and the commentary class, I think that's going to be the push.
Right. I have a question for Dmitry. In regards to the Western perception of Russia, it seems like everybody is still, especially people, millennials and older, are still sort of tainted by the Cold War narrative. Could you speak a little bit about how you as an Orthodox Christian is seeing the relationship between Russia and the rest of the sort of geopolitical situation, and how should a Western, whether they're Orthodox or not, how should a Western person understand Russia in the current geopolitical landscape?
I think they need to view Russia as it is at the moment, which, if we're speaking in good faith, Russia is a country which is emerging from a certain yoke, and maybe even a double yoke. And what I mean by yoke is enslavement, geopolitically, firstly from that of the Bolsheviks, communists, which allegedly it has freed itself from in the 90s. But as we know, in the Eastern Bloc countries like Romania, Yugoslavia, there were active illustrations in those countries. So they were essentially political, discriminatory legislative moves made against former members of the Communist Party. Notice that in Russia, this did not take place. Not a single communist went to prison in the 1990s, which means there was a clear, butter smooth transition of the former regime into the Yeltsin government, which later became, of course, the United Russia. And so me and Conrad are under no illusions as to who people are in, say, the Russian government, which parties they came from, their histories. I think given the bilingual aspect of our show, in some capacity, we are able to research those things quite deeply. And people should be under no illusion, especially after, say, the 24th of June, 2023, we have to understand that as the Prigozhin Revolt, as it's called sometimes. We have to understand Russian politics is very much mysterious to a lot of people. I think even Russians, nobody really understands what the regime over there is doing very clearly. The 24th of February, 2022 was a shock to a lot of people, and I think the church included. So for So I think people shouldn't view Russia as a monolithic decision-making machine. They should still view Russia as we Westerners view Russia, where there's a people and there's a certain elite at the top running the show. Now, the allegiance of that elite, whether it's to a Christian ethic or one which is capitalistic, such as in the 1990s, where they, hung out with the oligarchs in different saunas and banyas and were like chatting and literally making corrupt deals literally after work, which is true. Like Abramovich, Berezovsky, they describe Khodorkovsky's recent interview on Dude's YouTube. He's just like, yeah, we used to like hang out with Abramovich and Yeltsin and stuff, and Yeltsin's son-in-law. It's like these people are outright corrupt. And of course, in the Soviet Union, it was exactly the same thing. You had leaders of, communist leaders of massive corporations, like giant state-run, public-run companies, literally hanging out with politicians, behind the scenes, networking and making deals, which really, by conflict of interest, they shouldn't have been making. And so people should see Russia, I think, firstly, like not wearing any rose-colored glasses, that there is still, and I say this as a warning because we don't know, and even based on some of these prophecies, not all of them are airy-fairy, very nice.
Right.
Some of them are cautionary. And so we're actually not sure what the, say, regime in Russia, and I say regime in the most neutral sense here, what the regime in Russia what decisions will come to pass, because mistakes could be made, literal, and I'm not saying we'll be dragged into World War III, but definitely there were mistakes made in this SMO. You're not allowed to speak about it openly in Russia because there are censorship laws in place at the moment. As Alexander Dugin, for example, has mentioned in one of his interviews, the interview was like, Dugin, so what do you reckon? Why did the Russians retreat when, around the time me and Conrad started the podcast, September, October 2022? And Dugin's like, sorry, guys, can't talk about that. So you can't even mention. But the general question, of course, how should Russia be viewed? I think Russia should be viewed as an emerging power. Russia at the moment is a flowering seedling, which we hope, at least the Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, Patriarch Alexei II, are trying to sprinkle, holy water on the seedling to have it grow into a tree, an oak tree, a flower, something strong, something beautiful. But again, there are also people watering it with literally GMO vaccinated like syringe water, and they're trying to infect Russia. They're trying to build something that will bring them profit. And this is why we see Lord Jacob Rothschild visiting Russia very actively. This is, not Lord Jacob, apologies, Lord Nathan Rothschild, his son, the current Lord of the Rothschild branch of the family. He's good friends of the aluminium oligarch Oleg Deripaska, who you can Google, and he's quite a big figure. He's the aluminium king of the Russian, like he's a billionaire. And Lord Nathan and him are great friends. This is why Lord Nathan, you see him on Russian yachts, hanging out. He's visited cities like Pskov, ancient cities you'd read about in the Lives of Saints. Like, hold on, why is the Lord Rothschild what's he doing in one of these Russian cities? It's because the oligarchs are friends of him. And so, there are things happening in Russia behind the scenes, which unfortunately I think not only are we not privy to them, which is hence why we have to analyze some of these events, but also we see Russia, it's in this like almost like that meme where you have a young man standing on the road and there's a crossroad between two choices. I think we're still very much in that choice stage. And it's very scary. It's very scary because the West, obviously, Russia will not become liberal and LGBTQ-like, and we can see that with the death of Navalny. That choice is gone, I think. Russia won't become this neoliberal experiment that they tried to make it in the 1990s, but it may become perhaps something of an aberration of what it should be, maybe a lukewarm soy version of what I think the Russia that we want to see. And we see the oligarchs kind of move towards that direction. You see people like Prigozhin, they had very different ideas of what Russia should become. And these people held significant authority in the Russian society. And not everybody agreed with them. So yeah, I think people should view Russia as a rising power, not one which holds hegemony over the region. Or, I mean, look at the hegemony Russia held over Ukraine. Like, it couldn't even soft power influence the Ukrainian people to side with them as they entered. This is a failure in soft politics. Me and Conrad speak about it quite often. What were they doing between 2014 and 2022? Why couldn't they organize internal revolts? Things which Americans the American regime is professional at doing in countries like Afghanistan.
CIA particularly.
Absolutely. What was the FSB doing? I mean, there's so many questions as to why it took 8 years to, of course, begin a peaceful peacekeeping SMO operation. But on top of that, why did it take 8 years to organize something which didn't even successfully come to pass, which is why we probably see a lot of generals being fired at the moment from the Russian Ministry of Defense. And again, this only shows that Russia is very much a rising power at the moment still. yes, it has world's second strongest military, but it's still not a key decision maker, unfortunately. And that's okay for us Orthodox Christians. I think we just have to face reality.
Well, I think you've made a great point, because I've noticed, especially on X and some of the young Orthodox converts, is a very rose-colored lens in looking at Russia and Putin as like some Orthodox savior. And I am certainly not as well educated as neither one of you gentlemen on these topics, but it's kind of obvious and just pragmatic that, okay, well, he might do things that we agree with, but we don't know the sincerity of his heart or how closely he is aligned in, as you brought up, with the internal politics. Like, a lot of the young Orthodox guys think that, Krill, like, Russia is becoming, an Orthodox utopia of some sort, and that seems very naive. And so I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on, what is the power influence the church has within Russia, and how do you guys see the disposition of Putin? I'm sure, as you guys seen, the video of him crossing himself at a liturgy or inside of parish, and then all the Orthodox guys are, see, he's our Orthodox king. It's like, what's actually a nuanced, accurate perspective on Putin and the relationship to the Orthodox Church?
It's a good question. I was able to get a pretty good look at that. I was in Russia twice. I was there in early December of 2023, and I was there late February of this year. I was there to speak at the International Movement of Russophiles conference. It's connected with the Tsargrad Institute. I was able to talk to Dugin a few times. He's a nice man. I met his wife. She's very nice. But I'll be honest, I went to Russia and I loved it. There's no denying that, at least in Moscow, like, yes, like Tucker Carlson, his videos, those weren't propaganda. Like, the subway, it's nicer than America. The food is cheaper than America. The women are, there's more women than in America because they still have this women to male deficit. There's, people are healthier, these sorts of things. But at the same time, it was extremely obvious that when it comes to politics, it's basically the same as it is in America. It may be just a little, maybe 15% better on some metrics, but there's people there that are monarchists, that are Orthodox, that are, you would call them like the equivalent of like the true dissident right in America, except that like they're all Orthodox, so that's probably that's sort of the advantage, as opposed to America. We have a plethora of religions and we have to deal with the religion question, I guess, when we deal with trying to unite, as you could say, whatever it is, the right-wing nationalists, dissidents, whatever it is. But in Russia, it's Orthodox, but there's also like an establishment, like even people like I'm not going to spill too many names or anything because I have relationships and none of this was public, but there's people that are more closer to power that some would say have kind of abandoned their principles. Some people don't consider them as true national, like with the Trump thing. Like, there's people that now that back in the day might have been more based, that now that they've worked for Trump and they've been in the system, now they've abandoned their principles, some might say. And in Russia, there are nationalists. There are people that Dmitry, one of his most popular things, we were just on Greg Reese from InfoWars. We were on his show discussing the relics of the Romanovs. Oh. And in Russia, if you meet a hardcore Orthodox nationalist, somebody that is like a monarchist, these kinds of things, odds are they would tell you that they don't really necessarily believe that the current relics are legit, because they believe that what really occurred to the Romanovs was this ritual murder. And it was Dmitry goes on it. It's the most extensive coverage of this issue in the English language on our show with it. We have a show about it. We have a show with Greg about it. And Dmitry has 20,000 words about it on our Substack. Also on Un's review in full, if people want to read it there. But that is an issue where but if you ask to people like, even Dugin himself, I believe, and people that he's connected with, and I'm talking to both of these camps. I'm trying my best to network. They would be like, no, that's not, they're legit. That's conspiracy. You know what I mean? That's the kind of dichotomy. Just as you might meet somebody in America that is, maybe it's their opinions about NASA, maybe it's their opinions about something else that somebody else will be like, oh no, come on, man, that's crazy. But like, it's one of those kind of dividing lines for people. So in Russia, there's very much like Dmitry said, like there's things about the war that you can't talk about as much. There's no pretext of like a First Amendment per se. So like there's no denying that people that fall afoul of the current regime, even from a nationalist or monarchist perspective, while they might be slightly less likely than liberals, I guess, to fall afoul of the state, it could still totally happen. I mean, look at Igor Girkin, Strelkov, who I don't know how much the audience knows about the initial Donbass war starting in 2015, but he's like the hero of Donbass. I mean, he came in with special forces when nobody else was there to help the Donbass Russians and fought back the Proto-Azov battalion and all of these forces. I mean, he had to conduct plebiscites and execute murderers and rapists where there was no rule of law. I mean, this guy is like a modern day, like Lawrence of Arabia hero type character, and he's 5 years in prison because he was critical of how, Shoigu and the operators were conducting the SMO from like a nationalistic perspective. So there's no denying that, much like in America, there's dissidents that fall afoul of the state and face serious consequences. The same thing happens in Russia. And that's not to say that I don't believe that there are I'd be lying if I said I don't believe there were probably a higher percentage of people within the Russian apparatus working towards good ends. I mean, I believe part of people always talk about, we need to form an Orthodox political party. That's neither here nor there. What matters is that just more people in power are Orthodox. And that is undoubtedly true in Russia. And there's no doubting that the church is being revived. And there's some problems with that. Of course, some might talk about latent Soviet influence, but I was able to meet with, leaders in the communications department of the Moscow Patriarchate, and they are, the commitment in the Orthodox Renaissance in Russia is completely real. Like I can't deny that. Like there's no, like, you go to Moscow, the most visible thing, even if you weren't there on some kind of political or religious thing, the most visible thing is orthodoxy. It's not communism. It's not multipolarity or whatever that is. It's orthodoxy. There's golden domed churches on every block. There's just as much imperial statues these days as there are even communist stuff. So I do love Russia, and I would love to go back. I was there, and it was a beautiful place. But yeah, I mean, as far as political things go, it's very comparable to the U.S. because they've got a big population, they've got a Christian population that dealt with mass secularization. So there's really a lot of similarities.
Dmitry, what are your thoughts on that topic of Putin, what sort of power the Orthodox Church can exert within Russia, and what do you think Putin's relationship to the church is?
Very interesting. The one thing we do, I think, completely align on, myself and Conrad, and I think a lot of people, is that I can at least tell from an outside perspective, at least I hope that in good faith, President Vladimir Putin is at least trying to be an Orthodox Christian, in terms of, we can tell that he isn't catechized. And if you know anyone from the former Soviet bloc, you do know how difficult it is to go through catechism in your 50s, 60s, when you've been you went to high school and they taught you atheism as not an elective unit, as a compulsory unit. Like, you needed to study atheistic works. Your brain was, and he's not just that, but he's a former KGB agent, and KGB agents, FSB agents, the training they go through, similar to CIA agents. If you've spoken to anyone from the former CIA, there is a certain drilling they go through, and not a brainwashing process, but there is a certain psychological preparatory thing that takes place. So again, for a mind like that to come to the church consciously in his late age, I think it's very commendable, and it shouldn't be taken away from Vladimir Putin. And we also see a difference. So, for example, a contrast between him and, say, someone like Alexander Lukashenko, a good person. We also covered the president of Belarus next door. He's also a powerful, Eastern Orthodox figure. Eastern Russian figure, but he isn't Orthodox, and he consciously says that. He just says, "Well, I'm agnostic. I'm still looking into it." And he's like literally like in his late 60s. It's like, I'm just inquiring, man. And like he actually venerated like relics and stuff of Putin. So when they hang out, he attends the church and stuff, but he's just like, yeah, I'm just an inquirer. So he's like ever inquiring dude. And he's an example of someone who's honest. But Putin, he's already stepped past that. But we still see even yourself and Conrad are probably more catechized than Putin is, which all that says is that, unfortunately, I think the United Russia Party, those around Putin, maybe his staff, similar in a way to how perhaps Trump had the wrong people around him. I think Putin may not have the most well-catechized people surrounding him, and these people are not, and we spoke about this slightly with Andrei Afanasyev, the war correspondent, because he is like very, very, very patriotic, super Orthodox journalist, and politically minded. He's quite right-wing, I would say, from an Orthodox perspective. And we even briefly suggested that, well, it does seem like Russia could perhaps use this war in Ukraine, even if it was earnestly used, this idea, and we can see this in the Byzantine Empire, that the persecution of the church should be a catalyst for an escalation. But notice, Patrick, that it hasn't been used as a catalyst for anything. In fact, the Russians don't even quote the persecution of the church as a reason as to why they're in Ukraine doing what they're doing. They're simply saying, whatever they mentioned denazification, demilitarization, all these massive long-winded terms, and it's like, okay, what does that even mean? What I can see is that the church is being persecuted in Byzantine history, which is like really important, I think, for Orthodox Christians to study as you go through life. Like you'll notice events such as during Saint Theodosius II and Saint Pulcheria, his sister, during their reign. There was this really brief, like 6-month war with the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, and that war commenced in the 400s because of the persecution of Orthodox Christians in Persia. So the Roman Empire, the Eastern Byzantine Empire, went to war because of persecution, because the bishop of Persia was, I believe, killed by a rioting gang of, essentially Zoroastrians. And so the empires went to war because of persecution. And here we see, unfortunately, either Putin or the people around him are not willing to use Orthodox persecution as a catalyst. And perhaps you may say, well, that's kind of base. They're keeping church and state separate. But I'm sorry, but Nicholas II or Justinian the Great would have already, these ancient emperors and tsars would have already, taken and evolved by now. If they saw what was taking place, this is absolutely insane. The footage we see, the priests getting tackled, priests getting beaten up. There was a few clergymen killed. Like it's getting to a level where it's just already disrespectful. Zelensky's giving the Pope an icon of blacked out Theotokos and Christ. Like, I mean, this is already, it's a bit too far. TikTok videos in churches, etc. Too much. And I think former previous rulers would, of course, put their foot down. They would put the knee on the neck, so to speak. And this thing would have been shut down very, very a little while ago, I would say.
How outspoken is the Russian Orthodox Church and Patriarch Kirill regarding the persecution of the church?
Great that you asked, because just recently, and this is being critiqued by, unfortunately, a lot of these Greek jurisdictions, which have, I would say, fallen away from the Orthodox consensus by the support of the Ukrainian schismatics. And I'm talking, of course, about the higher ups, not the average person, the average Joe going to a church and taking, having confession, having communion. It's just like in Reaganomics, trickle down. There's a trickle down of sort of heresy and schism support in the church. The average, the Patriarch Kirill, in, I believe it was April of this year, announced the SMO to be a sacred war. Священная война in Russian, which translates directly to sacred war. It's literally, I'm not saying he called on like a Jihad June 2 style, but he did say that the war happening in Ukraine is one as much for the faith as it is for these political principles of demilitarization, pushing NATO back. And he announced this at the Всемирный собор Русского народа, which is essentially like the World People's Russian Council, which is like a secular gathering of Orthodox Christians, which takes place in Russia, possibly on an annual basis, sometimes biannually. But he announced this publicly, and Patriarch Kirill's word is taken basically as sort of like, and Patriarch Kirill is very, not lukewarm, he's very balanced in his takes. So he's quite, in fact, Patriarch Kirill, he's never visited Crimea since Crimea has been joined with Russia. I don't know if anyone knew this, but since 2014, not once has he visited Crimea. And you may say, why? These are, it's his jurisdiction, technically speaking.
Right.
So he did it not to agitate the Ukrainian situation, to not trigger people, literally. So he's very conscious of making these public big sermons and, calling Russian people to war. I mean, he hasn't even done it. All he said is he's labeled this war as one which is being fought in some large capacity for the faith, locally speaking. And in fact, based on what myself and Conrad have covered, it really does look like that. Even if Putin and his colleagues in power do not admit that openly, maybe due to a lack of catechism and the lack of understanding, like they don't actually see the world. We saw this in the Tucker Carlson interview. At the end of the interview, recall when the Protestant Tucker Carlson asked Vladimir Putin, well, why do you think world events happen, right? And Putin's like, well, I don't know, they just happen, man. It's like, whoa, I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but like that answer does not satisfy me, you, Conrad, anyone, none of the listeners. We wanted to hear, because, God's will aligns with, we wanted to hear about synchronicity in the world. We wanted to hear about providence, about God permitting evil. We wanted to hear something a bit more fulfilling. But in fact, Putin's just, man, things just happen, which is a very sort of opinion which a lot of, say, liberals, non-Orthodox people would have. And that's, I think, not because Putin's not Orthodox, it's just the fact of, well, he simply hasn't read, say, Father Seraphim Rose's Nihilism or some of the key works which we push people to read. So that's where I think it stands. Yeah.
What are some of the more prescient issues that are occurring right now that you think people, any of the listeners who are listening right now or listening in the future, should keep their eye on, and how they relate to Orthodox prophecies? Like, what are some of the key topics? And maybe you guys have different ones based on your own personal dispositions, but what are some things that if somebody's listening to this and they're slowly getting into these topics and hearing what you guys have to say and kind of shedding new light on the issues, what should they be looking for? What obviously conflict with Turkey, but it seems like we're kind of far away from the closing of the Bosphorus Straits. But like current things, what do you think people should keep their eyes out for? And I want both you guys to respond to that.
Yeah, I think as far as specific geopolitical stuff, obviously, I think Iran and Taiwan seem more on the horizon than necessarily Turkey getting involved per se. But you have Iran, of course, that brings in Azerbaijan as a huge enemy of Iran from the Israeli perspective. And Azerbaijan is just little Turkey. I mean, they call themselves like one nation with Turkey, basically. And I think right now, though,
which relates to their war with Armenia.
Oh yeah, and I mean, literally, that's happening. Literally happening as we speak.
Right.
Armenia is completely pivoting towards the EU and the West, and Russia is, and Russia at the same time, I think, has picked up Georgia. So there's been a bit of a geopolitical handoff, you could say, where Armenia is just totally gone with France and the EU and the West and NATO and everything, whereas Georgia has successfully kind of shaken off the yoke of the neoliberal pride parade holders and have passed their foreign agent law. They're trying to pass an anti-LGBT propaganda law, and now they're trying to reopen their embassies with Russia. So this is a perfect example of like how it's important to read the prophecies directly from the saints themselves, not just people posting about them per se. And we try to just, post the sources and talk about them because, I was in Russia and I met a lot of nationalists that said that every Orthodox person should move to Russia because Russia is going to be the only place protected during the times of the Antichrist. And then St. Gabriel of Georgia, or Gabadze, he says the same thing about Georgia. And up until very recently, I was like, man, these two prophecies can't be fulfilled at once. They hate each other. They're going to be on different sides. There were even Greek priests claiming to make almost prophetic musings about how Georgia is going to get totally destroyed if they don't, turn around and side with the Russians. But here we are, somehow, in the midst of all of these things, Georgia has managed to, I think they've just seen the light with Ukraine, and how Georgia and Ukraine are probably the most similar countries when it comes to this kind of thing. I mean, literally their president was like, they've had presidents and politicians serving in each other's offices because they were just so many Georgians are fighting in Ukraine right now. It's such a connected thing. But being able to look at these intra-Orthodox conflicts through the lens of the prophecies, I think, is so helpful because it is all clearly moving in that one direction. But the other thing, of course, being Iran and Israel striking Iran's nuclear capabilities. Of course, Metropolitan Theophytos talks about this all the time. St. Paisios talks about, 70 to 80 years, Israel is going to stop existing, which is a common trope that's been talked about, that Jewish states, they can't last any longer than 80 years. And St. Paisios, he discussed all of this back in like the 70s. And then in that same region, there's the Cyprus situation. Northern Cyprus is still unrecognized by everybody except Turkey. Azerbaijan is talking about recognizing it. There's a question of what if Israel recognizes it? These are the sorts of things that would start to delineate something where Russia and Greece could somehow be on the same side of a conflict that somehow has Israel and Turkey on a similar side, and all of these things. And that then ties into the big thing happening right now, which is this Muslim, some people in the West are mad that people are trying to ally with Muslims. Other people think that, we need to ally with them even more. And obviously on the show, we're not in favor of any kind of ecumenism with Muslims or anything like that. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that when I was in Russia, I heard, I believe it was Sheikh Imran, Hossein or whatever his name was. I can't remember. He was from Trinidad and Tobago. And he gave this amazing speech at the Russophiles conference. It was like the most based speech that was there. I was like, man, this guy, does he know about these laws in Russia? I don't know. He was going off. And he had a recent podcast appearance. Dmitry posted about it on his X account. This guy basically was asked. So in the speech, he says that basically Zionists take over the world, all this stuff, but the most strongest resistors and the holiest people at the end, in the time when the Antichrist comes from the Zionists, will be these Christians in Russia. And this is just this random Muslim sheikh saying this. Wow. And then he went on this Muslim podcast. I guess it was really popular. And the host is like some young Muslim, a Mohammed hijab type or something like that. And he's like, but sheikh, but Orthodox Christians, are they kafir? Are they kufir? Like he's like trying to make him like say
Right.
that they're
Renounce
just
the
like
Christians.
yeah. I mean, like in his defense, kind of like we would make somebody be like,
Right.
come on, man, like the Catholics, they're not Orthodox, like the Monophysites, they're not, doing one of those.
Right.
And he's like, I am not a fool. I am no fool. These people, like he basically just says it like at the end times, these people are going to be like the only allies that like righteous people will have, and that they're going to like. He basically like it almost sounds like he's saying like, yeah, man, he's totally saying that we don't need to convert them, all this stuff. So it's like, are you like,
wow,
are you just going to become Orthodox? Like I don't understand like but it was very interesting, and a lot of Muslims, there's certain Muslims that think this way, and I've met some very interesting people that. I didn't necessarily immediately try to convert them to Orthodoxy like some people might want me to. I tried to, keep the connection, but there's a very interesting thing developing, and that ties into that prophecy from St. Paisios about a potential third of Turks converting to Orthodoxy. I think even more than just the Turks, other Muslims, I think, actually could convert to Orthodoxy. And people might say, "Oh, this is ecumenism." And look, that's dangerous. I empathize that people are hesitant about that, because we can't have any kind of ecumenism. We know this 2025 stuff is on the horizon with the Pope conceding a lot of our claims. But I really do think that as especially with some of the prophecies like the Marble King and these wars between Russia and Turkey, I think there will be, even among Jews, perhaps mass conversion to Orthodoxy as those things happen. But yeah, obviously everyone knows about China, Taiwan. But I think as far as fronts that you're talking about, really watching, see if Israel gets the U.S. or they themselves strike the Iranian nuclear program is extremely relevant right now, because St. Paisios, Metropolitan Theovitos, even other saints have talked about how that is going to be like that, and the Bosphorus are some of the biggest
events, right?
that we're going to see here, I think. So, but yeah, Dmitry, I'm sure he has some thoughts as well. Yeah.
No, I completely agree. It's very important to pay attention to the Islamic world, at least if you're into politics. Of course, if you're just a regular Orthodox person, there's no use in sort of following Islam and what's happening there. But you do need to note that we Orthodox Christians were always very keen on going on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. This isn't some sort of philo-Semitic or Zionist perspective. In fact, people have been going on pilgrimages to the Holy Land for thousands of years, since the Muslims actually took over, as you know, David. I'm sorry, Patrick, you've covered this on your Assassin show. Like, you've covered the Middle Eastern history. We know since the Crusades, and even the Crusades in some capacity took place because the Roman Catholics were not given safe passage to the Holy Land. That was one of the, at least, pretexts. But Orthodox Christians, it's completely normal for us to be concerned about what is happening over there and in places like Turkey, which is now unfortunately not an Orthodox Christian land any longer. And in fact, we can go to Cappadocia and Istanbul, former Constantinople, and visit holy places there, or formerly, now desecrated places like the church in Hora, which was recently converted to a mosque. Now, we want to visit these ancient places of Christian origin, and we just probably best to be aware, best to at least Google or like watch your stream, for example, and find out what's taking place in these areas before traveling there. And even Armenia. What if we want to see Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark, landed after the flood? We want to see all these things, and unfortunately, these places are now engulfed in war. And going to Kiev, similar story. You want to see the Kiev Pechersk Lavra. They have over 80 relics of saints in those caves, the lower, the upper caves, the churches themselves, the cathedrals. Can you go there now? Well, it's literally occupied by Ukrainian National Guard and Zelensky's, shock troopers. You can't visit the saints. You can't venerate the relics. It's like, so it's for one reason or another. Even us,
communions. So you can't
exactly. You don't even know which church to go to, because you don't want to partake. You don't want to be a sheep amongst wolves in the presence of literal schismatics and heretics. And these people co-celebrate with Roman Catholics to, like, not trying to offend Roman Catholics that we think they're the plague or anything, but in terms of our theology, we're not allowed to do that. But these schismatics do it on in Western Ukraine. Definitely, we've seen footage. It's quite bizarre, just open ecumenism at this point. And so we, in a way, have to follow the news and geopolitics, at least from a loose perspective, in order to understand what is taking place in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe. Because, well, when we plan like pilgrimages in 5 to 10 years maybe, and we plan a trip overseas to visit some of these places we read about in the lives of saints, for example, it's normal. It's actually, pilgrimages are part of the Orthodox Christian tradition.
Right.
Like pilgrimage to Jerusalem back in the day during the Russian Empire, and it's very normal for us to want to go travel to some of these places.
So in regards to the current geopolitical situation and the prophecy of the elders and the saints, what are you personally keeping your eye on the most, Dmitry? Conrad, and maybe it's the same thing in regards to Israel, Iran, and the blowing up of their nuclear facilities, which Metropolitan Yofatosis spoke multiple times about. But I know that you have much more of an expertise within the Russian paradigm and Russian situation. Is there anything that you think most people aren't aware of, or things that you just want to highlight for people to keep in mind as they're trying to track and follow everything that's going on?
I think one of the prophecies which really is striking, Conrad mentioned that when he went to Russia recently, the Russian Orthodox monarchists and the really conservative people there, the new black members of the new Black Hundreds, they're very much aware of the cautionary prophecies of Saint Seraphim of Viritsa. This is a Western Ukrainian saint, and he stated very openly, I mean Western Russian that is, he openly stated that if Russia does not fix itself, especially its behavior, its geopolitical outlook, there will be a potential invasion from China into Siberia, all the way up to the Urals. So he's basically predicting a Chinese invasion of Siberia here, and
Right.
He's kind of having this cautionary, clairvoyant vision of the future, and this is quite scary. I mean, that's never happened in Christian history ever. China has always been super friendly with Orthodox countries. We did have the Russo-Japanese War, which the Russian Synod and the Russian Church, of course, stood firmly behind the Russian Empire. And even St. Nicholas of Japan, it was a very dark time for him. He went into reclusion for the year and a half, didn't show himself in the public. He just lived alone. It was a very sort of kind of apocalyptic sort of scenario in the East, but there is this fear, right, of a potential, and we see China rising economically. 30 years ago, this prophecy seemed, like baloney. Like, at least to the average Soviet, poorly catechized Christian, would be like, well, this is kind of irrelevant today. It's not just, this is a prognosis for the future. 2050, especially the Russian population not increasing. It's like China's growing like a giant monster. Yes, China has very peaceful history, but it's super concerning.
But it's the largest standing military in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to your point, 30 years ago, people kind of scoff at China, and I spent two summers studying abroad in China, and it's not as backwards as the Western person likes to think it is at all. And it's not even it's in a mixture of capitalism and communism too. That's a big thing that I think people, they hear about the CCP, and it's like they have these antiquated 1940s perspective of the Soviet Union, and that must be what China's like. And it's like, no, it's not like that at all.
Absolutely. And the other thing I think Russians are paying attention to as well geopolitically is obviously the prophecies of the Greek saints regarding Turkey. And of course, Russia has had many, many wars with Turkey in the past, and there have been older prophecies like pre-20th century, which have spoken about Russia taking Constantinople. And in fact, you can see Nicholas II, like, people say, well, he was soft, he was people slander him, and they claim he was soy, for example, like, just colloquially speaking. But that wasn't the case. He had a blueprint on how to rebuild Constantinople once he would have taken it at the end of World War I.
Right.
Constantinople was like Admiral Kolchak, General Yudenich were destroying the Turkish military. The Ottoman Empire was done. Nicholas II had Admiral Kolchak prepare the Black Sea Fleet in order to launch a special military operation to take Istanbul in early 1917. And the revolution happened 2 months later.
Wow.
So if by God's providence, the Russian people were not worthy of retaking the holy city, the second Rome, Tsargrad, as we call it in the Russian chronicles, we weren't worthy at that time to take it. Maybe we will be in the future we'll be able to participate in its reclamation. But the Tsar Nicholas II was planning to take the city. There was no sawing around about it. He was going to take Constantinople, and he was going to essentially his ancestors as well, all the Tsars of Russia since, I believe, at least Fyodor Ivanovich, which is a saint in our church, the son of Ivan Grozny. This is like the late 1500s. They were all planning major campaigns against the Crimean Khanate and against the Turkish Empire in order to liberate the Orthodox people. And we see the liberation of Bulgaria, the wars for liberation in Serbia, and of course, partially Russia did assist the Greeks as well in their liberation struggle. So the war against the Islamic Caliphate to liberate these Orthodox lands has always been kind of at the forefront. And Russians have, noting all this rich history, which you cannot ignore, because all of our great Russian heroes like Suvorov, Saint Ushakov, Saint Fyodor Ushakov, they all fought great campaigns and wars against the Islamic Navy and army. And so it's right clear in your face that our history is one in war against the Islamic Caliphate of the Ottoman Empire. But these saints speak about a future conflict as well. And this is not off the cards. The Russians are paying very close attention to it. But what's scary, I think, Patrick, and I've noted this to Conrad as well in private conversation, is that St. Paisios' prophecy, in a way, it's almost like, notice how it states, and I'm paraphrasing it, but we all know the prophecy kind of off by heart. He states that the Russians will take the city after a very bloody war, and then they will give it to the Greeks. Now, the question is, which Greeks are they going to give it to? Because the Greeks that we see right now ruling from Athens are complete libtards. Right. I just want to call it like these people have just voted in gay marriage. Why should Russia spend its manpower and the blood of its Orthodox citizens to give this city, which has an under 1% Greek population, to the people who are now supporting the schism in Ukraine? So it seems these prophecies seem somewhat unrealistic, but possibly things will change in the future. So, we do look at these sort of factors because, it does kind of, the prophecy itself speaks about a potential future, and also Russia just giving the city, or I think the words say something like Russia will be forced to give Constantinople up. So in a way, it's almost as if Russia and Turkey will go to war, but not in the conscious way of which, say, World War I took place, when Nicholas II had a plan. He knew exactly which churches he was going to rebuild. He had an idea of how to integrate Istanbul and Constantinople, not into an independent Greece, but into the Russian Empire, who was going to have two Romes in one, which is pretty epic. But and probably even the Ecumenical Patriarchate would have been under the Russian imperial. You'd have two seats of the Tetrarchy would be under the under the Russian Empire emperorship, which would have been pretty cool. But that's not what we see in the prophecy. We see Russia almost blindly, almost by its sin, going into a war with Turkey, forced by perhaps geopolitical circumstances such as the closing of the Straits you mentioned. Igor Strelkov in 2016-17, he's cautioning Russia, that he's saying, why is Russia still in Syria? Yes, I get it, we're supporting the Assad regime, but if our cohort, if our army and our navy in Syria is trapped and isn't able to get home through the Mediterranean, through the Straits, we'll be trapped there in the east and potentially destroyed. So I think that's probably one of the catalysts, is that Russian contingent in Syria. That's, at the moment, Israel is literally flying its planes over Russian bases, bombing Syrian airports. It's like, it's that close. If the Russian contingent, that expedition, you can call it, if that Russian expedition in Syria is destroyed by Turkey, Israel, NATO, an alliance of sorts, this will force Russia's hand into taking out its vengeance on Turkey. And perhaps that vengeance wouldn't be led by, say, Christian values either. It'll just be a geopolitical necessity, like a catalyst, in fact, like a secular one. And that's really scary because, frankly, we Orthodox Christians don't want to see another Vietnam War or another World War II, because these wars, in a way, took place without us being in the driver's seat at all. In fact, it was like we weren't behind, say, the Third Reich, and we weren't behind Great Britain, nor were we behind the US. We were not in power at all during World War II. World War II, in fact, was a war of states which were either Protestant, atheistic, agnostic. And I think that's the uncomfortable thing about researching World War II, is you notice there's really, and I mean this in the most general sense, there are no good guys. It's just a bunch of like non-Orthodox dudes fighting, basically, like massive countries, these massive leviathans of industry going at it. And it isn't like World War I, where you can take a particular side and be like, okay, I can see the Saints clearly side of the Russian Empire in World War I. It's like 100%, I'm down. Here it's unclear. And I hope in the future that war between Russia and Turkey, and the Russians hope so too, is not this unclear, almost SMO type, like, okay, well, what's going on? Like, why is Lord Nathan Rothschild like on a yacht, like cheering for Russian victory over Istanbul? You know what I'm saying? Like, we really don't want that to happen, because that would almost spoil this future victory that is predicted.
So my next question is related to the name of your guys' podcast, War War Now. And I've been of the belief that we've already, the Great World War, or World War III, and in a sense has already started. And I'm curious on your guys' opinions on this. I would assume I already know the answer and that you guys would agree. Obviously, it hasn't been officially announced, but, the escalation of Russia doing military drills off the coast of Florida, which was this week, is clearly signifying that, Russia is trying to flex some type of military muscle to demonstrate, like, hey, US, NATO, you guys are getting really close to the official line here. And for anybody listening who may think that I'm kind of out of pocket or I'm reading too much into it, I'm curious if what your guys' thoughts are. Is the Third World War, the Great War that the saints have already prophesized and discussed, is it already occurring, maybe at a sort of sub-official level? And if it is, make the case why you believe that to be.
My answer is resounding yes, and the reason I believe that is, well, Metropolitan Neophytos said it himself. I believe it was in 2022. He said we're in the second and a half year of the Third World War. So
Right.
people can take it up with him if they have a problem with the language. But as far as that goes, as far as just the material justification, I mean, I go by like death count, basically. I mean, sure, we had Iraq and we had Korea, and you had these big things that happened. I mean, frankly, for Korea, that was very peripheral still to World War II. It was sort of just some fallout from that between China and between China, Russia, and the U.S., NATO and the more Eurasian bloc that we're still seeing have conflict now. But there's just no denying that between Ukraine and the hundreds of thousands of dead in Europe, combined with what's going on now in Israel and what was going on in Syria starting in 2011 and was going on in Armenia, Azerbaijan starting up again in 2019, the potential for what could go on in Taiwan, even what's going on in Myanmar. We have tens of thousands dead in Myanmar in a conflict that totally falls along these geopolitical multipolar lines that nobody's even talking about. There's the war in Libya that we've talked about that was between all sorts of proxies that had Russia and Turkey on opposite sides of things. You have the perpetual Turkish battles against the Kurds across, what people perceive as Kurdistan. And then you have the possibility of, like, one of the other wars that, never reached anything where people were talking about World War III was all the Balkan wars of the 90s and early 2000s. And those are about to heat up again too.
Right.
Republika Srpska is about to secede. I mean, I'm seeing this on Twitter, literally tweeted while we're on this stream. President Vučić said a third world war is going to start in 4 months. Like, he just says this publicly, and now they're stocking up on oil and eggs and stuff. That was like what the quote said. So I think, yes, we are.
And that was Serbia?
Yeah. President Vučić just said this. And I think this is exactly, all of those flashpoints. Again, look at the Orthodox connection, or any, like, maybe China, Taiwan is probably the least place where I could maybe find some kind of Orthodox connection. But between the Caucasus, between the Palestinian issue, between the Balkans, between Russia, Ukraine, I mean, Orthodoxy is at like this cultural center of these issues. And I think when it comes to, the timeline of World War III or how it goes along with the prophecies, I think, even Elder Ephraim, he talked about how his monasteries were built to be these sort of refuges for America during the hard times. And like, the hard times in America could mean anything from, civil conflict among factions within the U.S., all sorts of famine or energy crisis, attack from outside, maybe it's 30 years from now, but, from the north and Alaska and all, who knows how these things could go down.
Right.
But
well,
also,
related to that, I had and this is, I'm going to keep this person confidential, but I have a friend that is in the military, or at least works with high-level people in the government. And he was talking, and he is an Orthodox Christian, and this was a private conversation, but he was telling me to download this app. And I said, well, why would I do that? He said, so you can track flights. You need to see how many military planes are going to Alaska right now and bringing American troops up there. And he said, something's getting ready to happen.
Yeah, no, I there's all sorts of, anything could, that's the reason why this is like World War III. One of the big things I would write about when I wrote, if people want to if they want to get a feel for everything, I have an article on the Substack. It was the first thing that's ever been put up there. It's just called World War Now. And one of the things I say is, like, were they calling it World War II during like the Anschluss? No, but like, that's obviously part of World War II. Like, you don't like it had already started at that point.
Right.
And Ukraine, Russia is bloodier than Anschluss, Czechoslovakia, all of these things. So like, if you're, again, it's on a longer time frame, the media and the technology that we have at the time kind of extends these things at a level that I don't think was quite happening at the beginning of the 20th century. But the Eastern Mediterranean and Ukraine are where, like, those are close enough to each other to where when those fronts kind of merge, which is why Turkey, I think, is so important, there's just going to be no way that you could deny that it's a third world war. It'd kind of be like the Eastern and Western fronts happening in Europe, finally kind of just coming together. There's just no way that you could deny it at that point. And that's why I think, Metropolitan Neophytos says they're just not saying it yet, because obviously, what ranks as the world war is somewhat of a something you have to look back on a little bit. But I did want to read, not like you've read these books to people a lot of times. I wanted to read them.
And shout out.
I wanted to.
And I don't mean to cut you off, but shout out to the Eschaton Vigil, the author of this book. And right now we got like 550 people on all platforms listening to us right now. If anybody's interested in these topics, I just want to give a shout out to the website, the Eschaton Vigil or Eschaton Vigil. And I actually did have your guys' stuff pulled up. Let me pull that up one more time.
Yeah, I saw they have some of our posts on the website, so that's super
cool. And so here, if you guys aren't already following, go follow Warward Now. So the gentlemen, Dmitry and Conrad with us right now, they do great work covering this stuff. Much more frequent intervals than, I look at it from the theology and the philosophy. They're following the news consistently. So make sure you go follow them. You can click their name in the video title. It's a hyperlink. It'll take you straight to their YouTube channel, and their Substack is in the video description. Make sure you click that and subscribe to their Substack. And I just wanted to give a shout out to my friend, and go to eschatonvigil.org. And for free, you can sign up on their mail letter. And I'm working with them, and we have a lot of great stuff planned in the future. And the whole website is, and everything that's going to be coming out of this is oriented around the reality of what Dmitry and Conrad is talking about, the reality of the saints and the elders, and creating a global community of faithful Orthodox Christians to discuss this stuff. And so there will be a membership coming soon, and the full website will be live around July 1st. But right now you can sign up and get all the updates, and we'll have, if you become a paid member after July 1st, we'll have thousands. He wrote this book. The second book is already 600 plus pages, and he has thousands of these prophecies that he's been collecting.
Wow.
And that's all going to be available for the website members. And as Conrad mentioned, he's a big promoter of the Warward Now podcast. And we have a lot of interesting stuff. So make sure everybody's listening. If you're really interested in these topics, go check out eschatonvigil.org and just put in your email. It's for free, and you'll be up to date on everything that's going on. And then I want you guys to give any shout outs, promote your stuff real quick, since we got a peak viewership right now, so people can follow you. And I just want to give a special shout out to Orthodox Boomer Grandma. Shout out to you, Alexandria. She just sent me an icon of the Transfiguration right here. This is from the Union of All Icons. They make beautiful icons, and this is the one they sent me before on St. Patrick. Go to unionofallicons.com, unionofallicons.com, and go help out our Orthodox Boomer grandmother and their wonderful icon and candle business, and go purchase an icon from them. It really helped them out. And I just want to give them a special shout out and tell Alexandria, I love you. Thank you so much for all the support. And thank you for this beautiful, I mentioned in a stream how I really wanted a Transfiguration icon, and I got one in the mail today. So shout out. Conrad, Dmitry, anything you guys want to promote, anything you want to push people towards, do that right now while we got peak viewership.
Yeah, I feel like everyone's here, the big YouTube audience, so please subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've experienced extreme Substack growth recently with our Greg Reese appearance, but subscribe to the Substack.
Excellent.
That's our home base. But the YouTube, we don't want to forget about it. We used to do more live streams. We want to do more in the future. So subscribe to the YouTube. That'll be where we do live streams. We'll tell the Substack audience too. But yeah, World War Now on YouTube, worldwarnow.co for Substack. Put your email in. That's where you can get behind our paywall, which is how you get access to, for example, the full version of the stream with Gregory Hears about St. John Vitatsis and things like that. But besides that, you can find World War Now on X. That's probably our main platform. It's World War Now _ is the username. You can find me on X as well at GnomeRad. That's gnome, like a gnome hat, like GNOME. And so you can find me there. Dmitry is on X as well at Canonist, Orthodox Canonist. You can see his profile picture right now is the same as what he has on his X account. We're also on Telegram, World War Now Telly. We're probably most active there because that's kind of, even if it wasn't public, that's where I just post stuff to keep it for the show every week, to look through sort of a timeline of this week in World War III. So be sure to subscribe to the Telegram and the X and whatnot. But besides that, we're on Rumble, but it's really just more of a backup. So subscribe there if we ever somehow get totally nuked from other platforms. But I don't know if Dmitry has anything else he wants to say. That's pretty much all of our stuff. Dmitry has some fantastic articles on the Substack, specifically recently about both the ritual regicide of the Romanov royal martyrs, as well as translations of Nicholas Kozlov's books on ritual war, specifically focusing actually on Khazaria. I know you've been doing screens on that recently, Patrick. So we're kind of on the same wave right now. I think the energy is, I think we've tapped into the energy, and we're just going where it takes us. So I think we're on the same wave on some of those things. So yeah,
make sure you guys follow our brothers and support their work. They're doing great work, and for me as a faithful Orthodox, I think it's very important, and it's a wonderful and insightful and important angle in the Orthodox world that isn't discussed often. Obviously there's a lot of us that talk about theology and all this in-depth, highfalutin intellectual stuff, but what you guys are doing, I think, is really pragmatic and very important. So go support our brothers.
Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. I don't know how close we're getting to the end here. The only thing I just wanted to...
Oh, no, we can keep going. I just wanted to... why we had a peak... Unless you guys have somewhere to go. Why we had a peak audience. I just wanted to give the shout-outs and get that way people watching right now, before we get to the end, because we got super chats as well. People have specific questions for you guys. So if you have any questions for our guest, send those in. You can use Dono Chat or Streamlabs, or if you prefer to use YouTube, feel free to use YouTube. And if you're really feeling generous, you can gift some YouTube memberships. I know the chat loves that. But we have a few different questions, but I didn't want to totally derail the conversation. I wanted you guys to promote your stuff, and I wanted to give a special shout out to Alexandria and, of course, the Eschaton Vigil. So sorry, Conrad, if you can remember where you're going, you were lifting up this book and talking about some of the prophecies. If you remember your thread, go ahead. And
totally. No, I'm locked in right now. No, I think I gave enough of a shout out to where I don't think Dmitry has anything else to shout out. But you mentioned just kind of things geopolitically with the prophecies that we're looking towards, and Elder Ephraim specific. This might be something we talk about in a second. Elder Ephraim has his whole prophecies about the volcano and the fault lines, and how Life-Giving Spring Monastery in the Sierra Nevadas is going to be like an island surrounded by water. There's all these sorts of things. But I wanted to.
Did you guys see the fault line in California all the way up to Washington, Seattle?
Yeah.
This was a secular geologist that said that it's possible that much of California could go under through this rising of one of the tectonic plates.
Yeah, I mean, 2012, that movie from like 2009, 2010, that Roland Emmerich movie, that was like my favorite movie when I was like a kid. So it might have just been total predictive programming there. Right. So, but this is just, to me, this prophecy stands out as one of the most, something that seems so ridiculous to even certain people in Greece and Russia, but cuts through, I think, sectarian or even nationalistic, frankly.
Explain the prophecy for anybody who's listening that isn't familiar.
Of course. This is from Martyr Eldris Danyushka of Siberia. I mentioned it earlier. She was one of the earliest martyrs of the Bolsheviks. 1918 was when she died. I believe the exact date of this prophecy is a solid few years before. It wasn't like she gave it as she was dying or anything. So I think it's a solid, so very early 20th century we're talking here. And she says that Russia will be supreme in the world. Her name will be Holy Rus. All sects and religions will pour into orthodoxy. So remember what I was saying earlier about that Muslim sheikh and whatnot. But orthodoxy, and essentially speaking, religion, will draw closer to what it was in apostolic times. In those centuries to come, there will no longer be any czars or corals but in Holy Rus, niaz, which the footnotes provided by the Eschaton Vigil say that a niaz is a prince or a duke, or maybe even like a regent or something like this, who will reign, who will come from the nation that gave us our religion. She's speaking as a Russian, and the nation that gave us our religion is understood to be Greece, the Byzantine Empire. And so being that, in fact, he could be like a Greek, ethnic, Hellenic national is what at the time what the language would have obviously been meaning. He will be a supremely spiritual person who will provide the opportunity for uplifting the moral fiber and the spiritual principles of the nation. And so this obviously ties into the St. John Vatatzis Marble King stuff that we talk about, which, if you've talked to Father Peter Hears, he's been to Mount Athos.
He actually referred, he referred to you guys and his son's conversation when I asked him about the Marble King. Do you guys want to, you can feel free to dive into that if you want.
Totally. We're actually going to be, we can't spill too many of the beans because we have part 2 of that is upcoming with Gregory, Gregory here probably in July. But yeah, I mean, I even have personal anecdotes from, spiritual children of Elder Ephraim that I've talked to that have told me things. So it's such a deep conversation, but I just wanted to highlight that specific prophecy about the potential of this king who's been talked about from St. Cosmas of Aetolia, St. Joseph the Hezekiah has talked about this saint and these things, and who knows if Martyr Eldris Danushka even knew about John Vatatzis or the Marble King or the Sleeper Saint, or the fact that there's supposedly been an incorrupt saint who's so incorrupt that he's effectively not even dead, basically asleep, like the sleepers of Ephesus, beneath Constantinople, somewhere beneath, perhaps beneath Nicaea, perhaps beneath Chalcedon, one of these types of places. The fact that he's, residing under there and is going to emerge and actually rule. I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know if when he rules, it'll be known that he is St. John Vatatzis. There's all sorts of theoreticals that you could get into when we're getting into these sort of things that would change even the fact that some of these things haven't been fulfilled yet, even knowing these things have changed my life, just my perspective on how things work, from a basic whimsical outlook on life to a sort of true, firm understanding that God is in control of these things. These are very consequential changes that the world would be undertaking. And I think the fact that Dmitry was mentioning that, there's all sorts of geopolitical circumstances that could lead to some of these realities being fulfilled without necessarily the Russian people becoming a righteous empire again, Byzantium being resurrected and ruled from Constantinople as a righteous Christian kingdom again. But I think that is a possibility. You've mentioned Metropolitan Neophytos so much. You think you've even watched a section of his video on one of your streams. It's that video called Changing Prophecies, the power to change prophecy.
Right.
I think that's probably the most important video everybody needs to watch before you dive into this, in any of this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
because
so you don't exactly, because some people
can't
get
become a
too
box
fearful.
ticker. You can't become scared, ready to tick. This happened and this happened, so now this is going to happen. It's
right.
The
Make
point
plans
of
to head out to the woods. It's like, just relax.
The plan of this, be prepared. Metropolitan says do these things, but the point is so that you can pray and repent, and that in theory a softer version or some of these things could be avoided, not to lord over people that that this is going to happen. The only reason part of the reason we do the show is because I view it as a fulfillment of St. Porphyrios's prophecy that the technology of the time would be used to spread these words. And St. Porphyrios talks about there being an ecumenical council as well, and there being new crew to guide the ships, meaning bishops and priests. And I think that's something actually that before St. John Vatatzis or the Marble King comes back to rule, or before even the Bosphorus Straits are closed, or maybe even before Israel strikes Iran's nuclear capabilities, who knows, there will be an ecumenical council. And of course, I think the Ukraine issue will be used as a catalyst to resolve all of the current worldwide jurisdictional disputes. This deaconess issue might be used to resolve all of that. And who knows, the ecumenical council may be called in response to this 2025 stuff that we're seeing happening between the Pope and Constantinople, and most likely also Alexandria.
Well, the letter that the Pope just put out, yesterday or 2 days ago, basically conceding
all of our points.
Yeah. Concedes papal supremacy. It's all lining up towards the 2025 reunion, which I've spoke, and I won't mention anybody's name, but I spoke with multiple clergy privately, and they fully believe that was the intention by nefarious powers to reunite the East and West in 2025. And now it's like everything's right before us. It's clear as day if your eyes are open.
Totally. Maybe I can shoot it back over to Dmitry. I know, again, I've been yapping.
Well, I was going to
Russia.
Go ahead. Don't want to cut you off.
Cue it all up was that Russia used to be, before the war and everything, actually much more ecumenically minded towards the Catholics. We know about the Havana document and some of these sorts of things that are concerning. Some people would have disagreements on how the Russians practice certain things regarding their relationship with Catholics, reception, vesting of priests, these sorts of things. But even Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, who was extremely pro-ecumenism with the Roman Catholics, ever since some of their Fratelli Tutti, against all sorts of their different specific recent encyclicals about LGBT stuff and unions, the Russians have said, ecumenical dialogue with the Catholics needs to be totally paused. So I think Dmitry knows more about it than me in that sense. I'm wondering if that specifically, and this shift away from Russia and the Pope is going to be a blessing, because when this union does occur, perhaps if some of this war hadn't happened or some of these other things hadn't happened, maybe the Russians would have been more inclined to, maybe even if the schism hadn't happened, the Russians would have been able to go along with, the ecumenical stuff. So I know it's your show. I don't want to be the one asking questions, but I know Dmitry might know more about that than me.
Well, I wanted to, sorry, my dog wants out. I'm going to have to let him out. Dmitry, the question that kind of spawned all this originally, and I just want to bring it back, is the name of your guys' podcast, World War Now. Do you believe the Third World War, the Great War, is at hand, and make your argument for why you believe that to be the case?
I think as with most things, conflicts typically, we do place artificial, man-made boundaries on when certain conflicts commence. For example, there was the wars in the Balkans prior to World War One, and they kind of spelled the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the end of the Ottoman Empire when Serbia regained independence, and there was all the various skirmishes between Bulgaria and Serbia, and really uncomfortable sort of situation in the pre sort of World War One era of the early 20th century. And typically we don't, kind of say that is part of World War One, but those skirmishes inevitably led to, unfortunately, the Masonic Black Hand assassinating Franz, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, and the empire at the time. And of course, World War One then began after the mobilization of the Russian Empire and mobilization of Germany, and inevitably the empires went to war. And we also saw that as a slow burn start here in a way, like, again, we Russians, we do, and historically, how did the Russian Orthodox Christians view world wars, right? This concept of, or patriotic wars, as we'd call them, in Russian historiography, and even the saints like Saint Philaret of Moscow, for example, the Metropolitan of Moscow, he would openly call the Napoleonic Wars equivalent to the world wars, and this is like 1850s, and he would refer to Napoleonic Wars as the Great Patriotic War of that time. And World War One by Russians was referred to as the Second Patriotic War. And of course, World War III, the Soviets one-upped it, and they said, this is not just a regular patriotic war, it is the Great Patriotic War. So it is like number 3. And so again, the way we label wars, I think, is almost kind of external to the war itself, because as I mentioned, like, yes, the wars in the Balkans preceding World War One, I mean, now from a bird's eye view, we can see how that clearly was almost the beginning, like the prelude, the entree to what was taking place. Unfortunately, in August of 1914 and onwards, which led to, like, tremendous changes in Europe and the world. But World War III, I think, as we see it now, everything that Conrad has said, and sort of adding to that, we see conflict breaking out all over the world, and that is because, well, we do know why the wars break out in the first place. The saints speak about it very clearly across the board. It's the overabundance of sin is one factor, and the Lord permitting these conflicts to take place. And why? It's for the betterment of the people. And of course, just as in the Old Testament sense, it is to chastise the wicked here on earth, maybe try to sober them up, wake them up to their sin. And what do we see now in the 21st century? It is like we are at peak. It is absolutely insane. And seeing churches desecrated and gay parades and people filming TikToks and witches, like, doing dances in churches in Ukraine, it scares me, because I'm like, are these people, it's almost like they're chaos, occult chaos acolytes trying to bring on the end of the world. I mean, this is something out of like a fantasy novel. And I'm just like, hold on, these people are insane. Not only did they, crucify Christ and cause all these various calamities throughout history, but they're also causing apostasy on such a scale, of course, funding various, everything from pornography to everything is being promoted in order to drown the world in sin, so that God would, of course, bring on something that would cleanse. I mean, it's masochistic in a way, because they, of course, in these various occult religions and cults, they also believe in a demiurge figure. And for some reason, in their sense, they're trying to trigger the demiurge to act. I mean, it's just completely nuts. But I think that's what's taking place here, and yeah, I think that's a very important factor, is that. And notice Father Seraphim Rose, Saint Seraphim Rose, and all the saints of the 20th century, even uncanonized saints, Metropolitan Philaret of New York, the former hierarch of Rokor, Archbishop Averki Taoshov, who worked at Jordanville for a long time. Any priest, I guess, over the age of 50 would have known him as one of their lecturers, perhaps, in Jordanville, especially the older generation. All of these bishops, especially in America, and holy saints and elders, have foretold of a war to come. Why I think this is the time now? I think we've reached almost, notice how Orthodox Christianity at the moment is the most populous religion in terms of growth, demographically speaking, in almost every Western country. It's unprecedented. The 20th century, in a way, was a time of stagnation. In a way, not saying that the church can never stagnate, but in terms of we were suppressed to the point of, as I mentioned, World War II took place without our direct participation. We were almost like the side characters. We were watching this thing take place, the globalists pushing this massive war, these sides fighting one another, and we had no impact. There was no what did we gain from World War II? Basically nothing, right? It just happened before our eyes, and nothing was gained. In fact, many things were lost. And the 20th century continued on with the pushing of the UN, all these various institutions which suppressed Orthodox Christian identity in various countries, locally as well as globally. They pushed the human rights type of global ecumenistic agenda on the world. And today, I think we're seeing the culmination of that. The system, obviously the hegemony of the US being at the helm, it simply cannot stand. It's sort of buckling. This golem that they've built is collapsing, and it's collapsing because of sin, because the very system that they created cannot, the fuel that they're using, the sin fuel, you could call it, is just simply destructive in and of itself. And I think it's bound to collapse, and it's collapsing now. I think we can see it. Naturally, you need to have an element of faith. You need to kind of understand that, well, this is taking place, and we just need to prepare, not fall into, which you speak about a lot in your streams, Patrick, that it's not a reason to fall into despair or depression or say like, oh, it's over. Remember what the saints say very clearly, that the end of the world is your little personal end of the world is when you pass away. You need to be preparing for that. Prepare for your personal end when you will be judged by Christ.
Right.
Don't worry about World War III or any of these massive things. If we all prepare individually, then naturally, the way we kind of, the way we impact society around us will hopefully influence greater sort of geopolitical forces as well. I think, from
whatever
small
happens.
to big.
And whatever happens. If you repent and you get right with God and you're trying to live your life the best you can, whatever your fate may be, whatever your providence is, whatever occurs in the future, that's out of your control, and you really don't have to worry about it. So it's like, I think Orthodoxy provides the best foundation to not have despair, and at the same time, the most clear vision of the future to see the tumultuous events that are going to be upon the horizon or already here, as we're kind of discussing.
No, I think when even when it comes to specifically even like, oh, is it ever going to be said, maybe at some point the church says we are living in the end times, however this happens, you still have to live your life, man. Like, you still have to get up and do your prayer rule and go to church, and the feasts are going to be the feasts and the fasts are going to be the fasts. It's not like something's going to happen in the world and like, oh, we can just put all that aside. We're in, whatever mode we're in now. I mean, look, like you mentioned about, earlier on the show, maybe we talk about like when the end times begin. The show isn't actually like, we talk about it at sometimes, but the show isn't necessarily an end times show. Like, we don't have any prognostications about, we know when Jesus is coming back or anything like that. Even though, we talk about Revelation. I reference Elder Athanasios Mitzilaneos many times on the show. I'm reading through his Revelation series right now. It's very enlightening. But I think a good example of this, while being specific and being, I think, kind of what people want to hear, being straight up about it, but at the same time, recognizing that these things are more, I guess you could say, epochic or generational than necessarily just boom, 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 boom. I would say that the end times truly began, like truly, like the kingdom of God, through the church on earth was then kind of disrupted in some capacity with the martyrdom of the Romanov royal family in 1918. I think I could spend another hour making a whole case for that, but I think between our writings and some episodes of Ether Hour, our premium show, we've made a really good case for this. And again, the final ritual murder of the cataconic Christian emperor was what was necessary for the beginning of, you could maybe even be as specific as say like the physical seed of Antichrist to be able to enter into the world. Right. And with that happening, I mean, 2018, that's 2 years after the Trump election. That's like almost a solid 100 years right after the death of the Romanovs. What did Metropolitan Neophytos say? It's like the 2.5 year of the third. It's like, it's almost like, again, we know that the Bible's not about like 1,000-year reign. It's not like that, but like it's at a certain level, you start to look at it and you're like, okay, this looks pretty symbolic. This looks pretty sequential here. And I think that's what's happening. And now after the first 100 years, they killed the emperor. Another 100 years, we're about to, right after that, they did World War I and II, totally restructured society, restructured morality, literally I would consider it an alchemical transmutation of like the world mind. I could get into the cosmology side of that, but again, that's a whole different show altogether. But I think when that happens, now that another 100 years have passed, we're on the cusp of, we just had the COVID thing, which you could describe as almost as dramatic of a shift in some capacity. But this third world war, I think, is what's going to be the next step. And that's going to be and whether that, again, there's the destruction of Israel, there's the Ukraine, all that stuff, maybe it comes later, maybe it comes during. But I think this past 100-year period, this 20th century has been the first 100 years of what you could call like the unrestrained evil in some capacity, still in a post-resurrection and ascension world, which I think is a pretty important aspect of what we talk about on the show.
Yeah. My next question for both of you guys or whoever wants to take it, Dmitry, feel free, is could you speak to the Ukrainian situation? And you've talked about the persecution of the church, and I've brought up Patriarch Bartholomew and the recognition of these false jurisdictions and how this is, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like you guys would probably know better than myself, but it seems like they're setting the table for these faulty jurisdictions to go ahead and unify with Rome, because they're already, many speculation about the EU, NATO, American powers, the CIA, all in relationship with potentially Patriarch Bartholomew. There's an article that came out, the CIA's man in Constantinople. Could you guys speak to the jurisdiction problem that's going on, the Ukrainian persecution of the authentic Orthodox Church, and how that specifically relates then to geopolitics?
Yeah, perhaps I could just start. And if I miss anything, Conrad can fill me in. So, we see it in Africa at the moment with the Russian Exarchate sort of commencing and the new Archbishop becoming the Exarch of Africa from the Russian perspective, Archbishop Constantine of Zaraysk. And you can see jurisdictional boundaries shifting, right? And this has happened in the past. Saint Justinian the Great has personally, as the Orthodox Emperor, also changed certain jurisdictional lines because he thought that simply, it would be better like that in the Roman Empire. So we've seen jurisdictions move before, right? Jurisdictional lines, sort of boundaries. But here, what we're seeing is this incursion of course, and Jay Dyer speaks about it. You speak about it. It's very, very obvious. Patriarch Bartholomew, either the CIA has some dirt on him, or perhaps people in his jurisdiction. And we do know, from inside sources, like, for example, there are issues in various local churches, various proclivities and sinful things take place behind the scenes amongst especially corrupt clergymen at times. And if somebody has that sort of stuff on tape, you could easily blackmail an entire church jurisdiction, especially if the monks leading that church jurisdiction, and they're of course black vested, that is in Russian terms, and they're all monks, right? They're priest monks, they're higher monks, they're archimandrites, they're bishops. These people are not married. And so my fear, like looking at what Patriarch Bartholomew is doing here in Ukraine, commencing firstly with this bizarre recognition of this Patriarch of Kiev Filaret, or at least going into communion with him, and then of course creating the artificial metropolia of Kiev, this sort of mirror jurisdiction with this essentially a layman, as we Russians call him, Serozha, like Sergei, who calls himself Metropolitan Epiphany of Kiev. And his name Epiphany, it's like, was this guy even tonsured? There's so many questions as to who this dude is. And it's scary, right? Because this guy is LARPing as a bishop, and he's co-serving with the Pope of Africa, Patriarch Theodore, at a service, standing at the altar. I mean, that's a clown show. I'm sorry, but that's scary, because that's a desecration of a holy place. And of course, it's disrespectful to us Orthodox Christians having this layperson dressed up LARPing. But more so than that, these jurisdictions have begun sort of collaborating with, as you mentioned, the Roman Catholic Church, which we know is very heavily involved and has been historically through, unfortunately, the Commonwealth of Rzeczpospolita, which is Poland, Lithuania. That Commonwealth has been very involved in Western Ukraine. There was a religious, spiritual war, essentially an eternal debate, you can say eternal blood sport type religious debate between Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians. This is like the boundary in Western Ukraine. They've been converting people to Roman Catholicism, probably in lesser numbers, and then Orthodox Christianity has also been converting Roman Catholics forever, for a long time in this particular region. And so you have the so-called Uniates, the Eastern Rite Roman Catholics, really abundantly acting in that area. But the leader of that particular branch of Roman Catholicism actually is completely pro-Zelensky. Not only that, but he's co-served with Metropolitan Epiphany of Kiev, this Serozha Sergei guy. And so they were already co-serving together with Roman Catholics. Again, not at liturgy, but at Vespers and Matins, and hanging out, doing malebens, doing these very small, like low-key services, not to trigger, because again, Ukrainian people on average are quite conservative, right? So if they would see that, they would automatically be like, okay, guys, Roman Catholics have persecuted us in the past. This is like really weird. This is something feels off. So they're doing it slightly, testing the waters. And I think Patriarch Bartholomew is probably signing off on this because he's definitely not criticizing. And
It seems
he's
like
claiming
it.
Ukraine as his fiefdom, essentially,
Right.
as this is his, jurisdictional, essentially jurisdictional colony. But one thing
Right.
I do want to mention, since we're on the subject of saints, we do mention them as our authorities for our foundations of our views. The three greatest saints from the Ukrainian lands, and I say this as somebody who calls Ukraine Western Russia, but I'll just call it Ukraine for ease of, I guess, comprehension. Elder Zosima of Donbass Donetsk, not canonized yet, passed away in 2002. He explicitly, clairvoyantly predicted this schism, and he stated that in order to remain Orthodox in Ukraine, he's telling his spiritual children and the people who used to visit him and his monastery in the Donbass region, he said, you need to remain loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate and that jurisdiction. Do not go anywhere else. And he also predicted the war as well, like as in clairvoyantly foretold it. Which back then, 2002, by the way, Russians believed less in World War III than, say, Americans did. I think we Americans after 9/11 were like, all right, something's beginning here. Like something's so Americans were more cautious. Russians, even my father, my grandfather, all of my relatives, right? Nobody saw this Russian-Ukraine war coming, say, 10 years ago. Completely unpredictable. There was no prognosis for it. I mean, 2014, so let's say in 2013, no one saw anything coming. 2014, you could already smell something in the water. But yes, going back to the elders, the other two saints we hear about the city of Odessa quite a bit. Odessa's been bombed. The Transfiguration Cathedral in Odessa was hit by a Russian missile. Turns out it was a Ukrainian anti-air missile that fell on top of the church's roof, destroyed it. This is the chief cathedral in that city on the coast of the Black Sea in Ukraine. The city of Odessa had a particular saint, the most venerated priest, essentially like a Saint John of Kronstadt 2.0, Saint Jonah, or he's not canonized yet, but Elder Jonah of Odessa. And he lived during the Soviet period in that particular city. He openly predicted, he's actually, one of his clairvoyant statements was that, yes, Russia, there will be a war in Ukraine. He's also, one of his prophecies is in the book you mentioned earlier, Elder Jonah of Odessa. He speaks about the war. He mentions the three Easters. One Easter will be Hungary. One Easter will be, he mentions the 3-year period of the World War, essentially. I don't want to wrongly paraphrase the prophecy. Mm-hmm. He spoke, again, of remaining loyal to the Russian Patriarchate, not falling into schism. And the third saint, of course, is St. Lawrence of Chernigov, who we all know, canonized. He lived under Third Reich occupation when the Plan Barbarossa pushed eastwards. He's a very well-known archimandrite, sort of a hegumen, a priest monk, who was also active in the Chernigov region, which is northwest of Kiev. Very, very authoritative saint. He also prophesied, by the grace of God, that Russia again will be restored to orthodoxy. He said this in the 1940s, whilst under Third Reich occupation, which nobody would believe that. Everyone was like, all right, what are you talking about, Father? But he did foretell this, and he also foretold, of course, the Ukrainian schism in the 1940s and 50s, which again, back then, nobody, these three elders, you can Google them. There's articles about every single one of them, not on our Substack, but specifically orthochristian.com, which I think is quite authoritative of a lot of people. Very, very balanced Orthodox Christian website. There's articles about Zosim, Elder Jonah, and of course St. Lawrence of Chernigov. These people have essentially foretold about this geopolitical calamity. But what's interesting is, how does this tie into Epiphany, Patriarch Bartholomew, and all the shenanigans? Both of these figures who promote the schism never mention these saints or elders. These people are not of authority to the schism makers. The schism makers are acting through complete pride, artificially creating various church jurisdictional borders, and essentially infiltrating the domain of the Russian church, which has been the domain for, you could say, 500 plus years at this point, like since Russia became an independent autocephalous church. Right. Every single saint, hundreds of priest saints, deacons, and bishop saints, I'm talking about just the clergy at this point, have served in Ukraine as sort of an element of the Russian Orthodox Church, a branch of it. There's no one ever says that the Patriarch of Constantinople held some sort of major power in this area. Again, it's very papal of him. But the last thing I want to mention is, I did go on a bit of a rant, but what's happening, the co-serving in Western Ukraine is so scary, because it shows perhaps what will take place in 2025, this coming papal collaboration that's being built on, whether or not it'll just be like a kiss on the cheek and like a kiss of the Quran on the side or something, or will it be an actual co-serving religious ritual which will take place, right? Essentially a falling away of Patriarch Bartholomew already, in totality, essentially anathematizing himself, right? And sort of showing us that he's separating himself from the Orthodox Church openly next year in wherever it takes place, in Nicaea, in Turkey, or in Italy, in Greece. I think this was a beta test in Western Ukraine, seeing how the Orthodox and Catholics, how can they get along if subverted enough?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be my perspective as well, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, as far as the church situation in Ukraine, again, it's probably been the most consistent story every week. Some weeks on the show, there hasn't been as much World War III stuff. Maybe there's nothing to talk about with Turkey. Some of these things were like, this week, whatever. But every week, regardless of how hot we consider the war, there's been something new in the persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That's not us stretching the news. That's not us like digging for like small stories. It's just like that alone necessitates us, I think, every week to do the show, because whether it's a new, like, because like they do a good job of trying to hide it. It just happens so frequently that it still gets out to the world. And like some of these videos where they're just beating the priest or dragging them out from the iconostasis, they don't want those to get around, but something like that still comes out almost every week. We recently discussed, while I was actually in Japan, Dmitry discussed it with our friend GSP, the total destruction of the Church of the Tithes in Ukraine, which was where it was in 2006 or 2016 or one of those years when a very beautiful apparition and appearance of the Theotokos occurred during the service to this congregation, and it was this little makeshift church, and the Ukrainian government destroyed it, and they've given it over to the
Wow, I didn't even know about that.
We had been covering it for a few months because they've been talking about destroying it. They've been secretly moving in the construction equipment because they didn't want the parishioners to be able to go into the building and stop it from happening. So these things are happening all the time, and I think part of how it's going to lead to World War III and how it's going to coalesce with this basically big separating of the wheat from the tares in the Orthodox world is, you see the papal stuff. Obviously, it's going to be, I think, a drawing line for this coming union in 2025. But we plan on talking about this week on the show even more. Is even right now in Bulgaria, they're about to have to elect their new patriarch. One of the major candidates is totally going to support the schismatics in Ukraine. So if he somehow manages to come to power, then we're losing like a whole patriarchate basically in this whole new schism. And I don't know what that's going to be like. It's going to be horrible for Russia. It's going to be even more confusing for those of us in jurisdictions like Antioch.
Is he the likely candidate to be elevated?
I don't think he's quite likely. He's being called out, but he's one of the two likely people. There's also somebody that wouldn't support him, so we have to pray for that situation. But you see how this is going to happen. Is Romania going to face the same pressure? Romania has more NATO influence than Bulgaria. What's going to happen if they have something happen there? Cyprus, even the most stalwart pro-Metropolitan Onufri metropolitans on Cyprus have concelebrated at the very least with the other bishops that have concelebrated with the schismatics. Some have even stood by as they did Vespers or something. The only one that has truly resisted everything is Metropolitan Neophytos. He still hasn't even concelebrated with the new Archbishop of Cyprus because of the schism issue. And that's why he's the man, right? But but not everyone's going to be as brave as Metropolitan Neophytos. But this is one of those things where even before 2025, there might really be the way that the devil and this whole thing works and the Holy Spirit allows is that people are going to make their call on the Ukraine thing, and then that's going to be how it works with the Pope. It's not like, I think most people would be pretty hard pressed to be like, yep, we're signing up with the Pope. But if they sign up on this confusing Ukraine thing beforehand, that'll be an easier decision to just defer to the State Department backed Patriarch of Constantinople right now. And we can pray for the Ecumenical Council and the new crew to come right the ship that Saint Porphyrios talks about. But I don't even know any candidates for Ecumenical Patriarch that have good opinions on anything. Like Elpidophoros, Metropolitan Emmanuel of Chalcedon. Like these are like some of the worst minds in the Orthodox world right now. So like there's people that would make us pray for Patriarch Bartholomew to come back. So
I saw an article out of Greece recently that was basically there's certain powers in Greece that are trying to put pressure on Bartholomew to step down Elpidophoros as the Archbishop in America. But I've also, through private conversations, I know a lot of Orthodox clergy, even in the Greek church, are afraid or believe that Elpida Force is also being groomed to become the next Patriarch of Constantinople, which would be a horrendous idea.
Yeah, I think thankfully he's faced enough backlash now from just the Greek people in Greece that's probably not going to happen. But there's Emmanuel of Chalcedon. There's a number of other people. I believe it's Polycarp of Rome, who literally kisses the Pope's hand and says the Pope is his bishop. So there's we could get it. I don't know. This stream doesn't need to become the terrible things coming out of the Fanar, but people need to realize that this 2025 thing, maybe it's me and David Patrick Harry and Jim Jatras and Father John Whiteford, those people. It may not happen, but it's at least very much not an unlikely thing to come down the pipe. So people need to be, again, you don't need to be freaking out about it. I just think you need to be discerning and realizing that there could be some unfortunate things going on. And in America, we've experienced all sorts of scandal with bishops and things even recently. So there's no need to think we couldn't handle it. It's just, this is going to coincide with the heating up of the Third World War. Is there any, why wouldn't it, right? If this is truly something that is, if we're truly getting closer and closer to what would ultimately be the preaching of the Orthodox gospel to the entire world, and then whenever it happens, the second coming of Christ, then the church is going to become more and more relevant to, unfortunately, the things and machinations of the world, because it's challenging those things. It's challenging people's tendency to go to war. It's challenging this ideology that has led to the conflict, that has led to all of these slow-boiled conflicts that become basically inevitable to even a generation of what you could call righteous politicians, or politicians that try to do the right thing. They can't untangle some of these messes that have been created over generations of neoliberal propaganda as opposed to versus communist propaganda and all of this kind of stuff. It's been a perfect storm that the devil is ultimately behind. And so, of course, if you recognize that the devil and his entities of the air are behind all of these things going on right now, then of course the church is going to become caught up in it. And bishops in the Antiochian church get kidnapped by ISIS, churches in Gaza get bombed, schisms happen in Ukraine, people get blown up in wars between Georgia and Russia, even though they're both Orthodox brothers, and same with Russia and Ukraine. These sort of things, the devil will use these things to confuse you, to get you to apostatize. Will use these things to get you to not have a family. Anything that they can do to use these circumstances. But look at that and realize that that's exactly what would happen, and that the church is going to respond. And I believe there will be councils and there will be bishops that stand up to this. And even if there is a time when there's, one bishop in a catacomb church in the mountains of Georgia, there will still be the Holy Spirit there for everybody that is following the true faith that was once presented by Christ unto the apostles. So,
and as Metropolitan Neophytos says, we only need one good bishop for the church to exist. And so there'll be plenty of people that fight back.
And I mean,
go ahead and finish.
I was gonna say, and we got emperors sleeping underground, so you might think of those, but don't count us out. That's not over till it's over.
Yep. We got multiple questions for you guys that I want to get into, but the last general question, and also if there's anything we haven't discussed that you guys want to highlight, feel free. But my last question, and this is more about speculation, this isn't about necessarily telling about facts that are occurring at the moment or recently. What are your guys' thoughts about the Ukraine, Russia, really, it's not really Ukraine, it's NATO, the West, Israel and America versus Russia. What would be some of your guys' speculations for that war? Obviously with NATO announcing that they're wanting to move U.S. soldiers, and even though it's been hidden by the White House, we know that U.S. generals already been killed in Ukraine. So, and through the prophecies, I believe it's 6 months that one of the elders prophesies that there'll be an air battle between the United States and Russia. It'll be 6 months hot war around Ukraine, and then Russia will actually become victorious, and then it'll be a 6 month era of peace or something like that. What are your guys' thoughts on the Ukraine-Russian situation moving forward, maybe the rest of the year or the next couple of years? Just what are your guys' general inclinations, and how does that relate to everything in regards to geopolitical and everything that we've talked about?
Well, I guess I'll just commence really briefly. Me and Conrad, we speak about this a lot off air as well. It's probably one of the only things, because we're so obsessed by and we're so much in the sphere of news. We do kind of talk about things. Well, what are we going to cover this week? What are our personal predictions? And do they change? For example, the Kroger City Hall, which you covered, Patrick, that terrorist act, like 145 people dead, and that's only what's announced, right? There's still like allegedly people missing, etc. The very mysterious terrorist attack. We cover the esoteric side of it a little bit in some of our episodes, but like that was a horrendous act which escalated across certain red lines, and eventually that act on the eve of a certain feast day called Purim, it essentially necessitates Russia to not, especially with Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, right? So he's literally the head, like equivalent to the head of the CIA in Russia. He openly stated the SBU, the Ukrainian Special Forces, the military intelligence arm of it, was actually, was behind this terrorist act. So this is the official Russian narrative. And now that they've proclaimed it openly, you can't let it slide. You can't let a terrorist act of this capacity, of this scale, just simply be washed away. There needs to be some sort of some sort of punishment, justice, right? And notice how still nothing has been done. But one thing that has changed, and I think we see this through Putin's interviews, because this terrorist act took place after the Tucker Carlson interview, in which Putin was a little bit like moderate. He seemed like he was possibly willing to go for a peace treaty. And even his colleagues like Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, he's always talking about peace. He's like, yeah, we just need to be friends, man. We just need to chill. And like, that's, for whatever reason, the Ukrainian side is not looking to chill at all. And so I don't think we're going to see a peace treaty this year. But we know that one's in the works. We know there's this clownish show that's going to take place in Switzerland at the end of June, when Zelensky's traveling around the world right now. He's like, he hasn't been in Ukraine for the last 2 weeks.
Right.
And there's no coup happening inside. So we know Ukraine, Kiev, is so CIA controlled that even though local Ukrainian, be it Banderite, be it libtard, neo-Nazis, internally, when we know Ukraine is a very, like, even they, I don't think, internally don't acknowledge Zelensky's power, because he's just a random actor. He's literally a clown.
Right.
And so these people are power hungry, and they still cannot coup their own government, while Zelensky's outside of the country, flying around on his plane, doing tours of Europe, France, Canada, US.
With the support of the Ukrainians. I mean, at least, and I could be wrong, so correct me, but from my recent reading, I was reading an article that Ukrainian support for Zelensky is incredibly low.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And still nothing changes.
Nothing changes.
This is how strongly it is controlled by NATO. It's literally, as my friend described it from Ukraine, there's an intelligence building, and there's an entire floor, like, 80, 100 people who are just purely like US intel staff, just like manning, okay, guys, we're going to take floor number 15 or 14 here, and we're just going to bring out, this will be our office now. This belongs to the US, and we're just going to work on things here. And yeah, essentially, so peace treaty wise, that's the big talk. Will there be a peace treaty? I think after Crocus City Hall, especially after those Tajiks were sent in and they were hired by, in the assassin theme, by hidden imam from somewhere from abroad on Telegram. The hidden imam on Telegram hired them. And of course, Bortnikov's like, it's the SBU behind the hidden imam. And I'm just like, whoa, this is like, I would just recommend people check out
the hidden imam that's in Washington, D.C.
Exactly. It's like, this is nuts. Like, are we talking about the Middle Ages, or are we talking about 21st century? But it's,
well, can I ask you a question real quick? Because what's your general consensus then with this recent peace offering by Putin? Because what you're talking about is that there will be some type of retribution for that terrorist attack. Was that really just a sort of political signaling that he's trying to garner the support for all these countries that aren't directly involved right now, to show that Russia's not the actual aggressor, knowing that the West would never accept it in a million years anyways?
Absolutely. I think that's the case. I think Russia's banking on, when Putin says he doesn't care who will win the election openly, he said, oh, we actually want Joe Biden to win as a joke. I think Russia kind of wants Donald Trump to win the election. And I only say this because it does seem like the Biden administration, whoever's behind Joe Biden, the deep state, for whatever reason, wants to continue this war on and on and on. And so perhaps Trump will bring in additional options for maybe a buffer zone along the Dnieper, or maybe half of the Kharkov Oblast becoming this, what Putin openly calls a sanitary zone, where there won't be any bombardments or anything of this sort. But as Russian political analysts for the last 2 years have already said, if there is a peace treaty, which let's not be surprised if one suddenly comes around tomorrow, because these people make decisions behind the scenes, I would say even without consulting people like Metropolitan Onufriy and Patriarch Kirill. The evidence for that, by the way, is the 24th of June, when Prigozhin drove his trucks towards Moscow, and there was like literally this like Mad Max Fury Road style situation. Remember, Patriarch Kirill panicked, and he openly said on his social media that the Patriarchate announced, they stated, well, let's have prayers to, prevent civil war. But you had people on social media like Jackson Hinkle, internally Russians even saying that nothing bad is going
on that Hinkle, dude.
We can discuss him too. But well, I mean, we've had our interesting, yes. But we had people saying that Prigozhin, this is a psyop. The idea that the Russians did the whole Prigozhin thing as a psyop, and they lied to Patriarch Kirill's face, telling him that there's a civil war brewing, and he ordered every single church around Russia, 40,000 churches, to begin public prayers for God to save Russia from a civil war. I think that's very disrespectful. The church does not participate in geopolitical psyops. I mean, that's one thing the church. Yeah,
do you think it was a psyop? I mean, that's what I was going to ask you. Who was, like, Prigozhin, was it his own initiative to do that? Do you think there was ulterior actors that were pushing him on? Was it an interior civil war? I mean, what are your thoughts about that? Was it a psyop?
Well, me and Conrad have discussed this a little bit. I think given his demise, and again, I'm not the expert in numerology, but the event took place on the 24th of June, and at the end of that summer, on the 24th of August, his plane crashed over Tver, north of Moscow. So, I mean, that's wild. Alongside Dmitry Utkin as well, who was the Wagner. He's the greatest hero of Russia. He is G.I. Joe. Dmitry Utkin has 6 awards for bravery. No one comes close. The closest other person would be like another like Spetsnaz guy who has 4 awards. So Dmitry Utkin was like a head and shoulders above the next guy. He also died in that plane crash. Putin, in an interview, and I mean, me and Conrad found this disrespectful, but we also don't know why Putin said this. Maybe he had some. He stated that he alluded to the fact. He said, "Well, they should have had an autopsy report for narcotics on that when that plane crash took place," because he stated, "Well, these people, like, they have a lot of cocaine. They found kilograms of coke in Prigozhin's office in Petersburg." He stated, "Well, perhaps that they were under a certain influence and they started playing around." Allegedly, Putin said, "The experts told me that they were playing with a grenade in the plane." So they sniffed coke, and then they were. I mean, that I don't believe that. There's no way Dmitry Utkin, GRU, the guy who's like he's in his 50s. He looks like he's like the bald like Cobra Commander style. Right. This guy's like the top level Russian soldier, would be snorting coke with Prigozhin, whose grandfather is a Khazarian, and then they'd be throwing around a grenade in a plane, flying to pieces. Like, this is a crazy version, right? I mean, there's no way. That's disrespectful, firstly, to Russian officers, to Russian heroes. So I don't know why Putin said that. The question is, did Putin openly joke about the death of a hero of Russia, or is there internal beef? And this is why Prigozhin, notice Prigozhin, he was the former chef of Putin. He's probably the only person in Russia, one of the only people who's actually seen Putin, get a bit tipsy at one of his parties, at one of his restaurants, privately suited, where Prigozhin would invite top-level Russian politicians. And that's fine. We Orthodox Christians, we love alcohol. Like, as at parties, we're completely fine with drinking at feast days. And Prigozhin, I'm sure, had, he's the one who organized all the feast day events for Putin in the past. But he was a personal confidant. And Putin perhaps had beef with him as well, which is why perhaps the 24th of June, going back to that question, was it legit? I think partially yes. But we don't necessarily even know who Prigozhin was driving to get, like Mad Max style. Was he after Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, which he openly stated he was after him? Was it just a show of power? Because notice he stopped. Like, we were literally expecting him to enter into Moscow. The Moscow police were panicking. The illegal immigrants were panicking because as you drive into Moscow, you go through the outskirts where all the illegals and the so-called brown immigrants live, and it's like, well, these guys were going to get there was worries of riots taking place basically in Russia because the immigrant population on the outskirts is so big, and once they see Wagner trucks and tanks driving through in full speed, it'll be like complete chaos. But yes, I think we still don't have an answer. And me and Conrad have been looking into sources from all sides. That's one of the biggest mysteries of last year, was that event and his death, and zero clear answers as to what that was about. We can only sort of speculate and analyze it, again, from an Orthodox perspective, because we do see the church essentially being abused as well by scaring Patriarch Kirill. I mean, this event scared everybody, but Patriarch Kirill included. And but yes, regarding like prognosis, right? Before Conrad probably has a better take. I think Ukraine is for some reason crossing all these red lines while pretending to go for a peace treaty. And again, Vladimir Putin, as well as his administration, rightly so, they have the high ground, being the victims of these various terrorist acts or these bizarre chemical. We've all seen the drone videos. It's really horrid. The Ukrainian style of war, and I don't mean this against the Ukrainian people, it's the regime that's doing this in military leadership. It's just completely horrible. It's inhumane. It's against the Geneva Convention, various pre-World War I conventions of warfare. It's horrible. The chemical warfare, like, it's crazy.
Right.
And so I think what we see is Putin needs to vow for peace as a Christian. He needs to aim for that. He needs to try and he needs to, I think he openly calls for it too, but he probably understands inside that a Minsk 3 will not take place, right? Like, if you recall, Minsk 1 and 2 were those peace treaties in 2015. That's simply not going to take place. So my prediction is no peace treaty for this year. And unfortunately, the wheel will keep spinning, and the fire will keep churning, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all of what you said, Dmitry. As far as, just to briefly say the Prigozhin thing before I give my predictions, just to give my take, I think as far as what we thought was happening, there's a chance that Prigozhin thought that, perhaps somebody like Surovikin and maybe some other characters that had expressed sympathy towards him that there would have been more of an organic rally of support to him, that there was enough disdain for Shoigu and some of the other, you could say, the deep state within the Russian military.
And why is there animosity towards Shoigu?
Well, people, I mean, obviously, Prigozhin had his complaints about not getting ammunition, this, that, or the other. But, somebody like Strelkov, who's in prison, would say that these people are playing a game with this whole thing, basically, that they're not serious about liberating Donbass. They're not serious about fighting some holy war with the West, that it's this very deep political, geopolitical consternation where they're only going to do certain things if they can make money on the military. Just kind of classic bureaucratic corruption kind of thing. People that are true believers complaining that bureaucrats are not actually putting the people first in these sorts of things. And Strelkov got arrested as opposed to other dissidents because he was actually, I think, more willing to directly criticize Putin with not as much of a direct connection to anything specific, so it didn't seem as legit. But either way, there's all sorts of things I think that Prigozhin maybe thought could have happened that didn't happen. And then I think the assassination, I've always posited that there's still a chance that French intelligence with some other kind of Western power was behind it because, Utkin was there. It was a big damage to global Wagner operations. I mean, they've been extremely successful in Africa. Right now, there's another coup happening in Burkina Faso trying to overthrow the extremely pro-Russian government there. So I think the U.S. and France and these powers might be trying to claw back some of the geopolitical territory that, because Wagner was able to operate as the Russians took care of Ukraine, it was able to work. But now the Russian government, the military, have had to totally take over. I'm forgetting the name. It's like the Sahel group or whatever the Wagner Africa name is now. So that's ostensibly distracting some of their command and everything like that. So I think it's easily just be part of the 5th generation warfare that we're witnessing right now. But I'm not naive. There's a chance that the Russians just blew them right out of the sky. Like, that's obviously like what could have happened. Like, they're the most they're the most likely candidates just for where it occurred. Right. But I think Dmitry has a point that Putin's answer was very strange, and I wouldn't be surprised if that answer is so strange that maybe they really don't know what happened. So that's honest enough there. But as far as predictions for the war, I think what we saw recently was Putin requesting, like you mentioned, his peace proposal. It was basically we get all the full 4 provinces we have, obviously Crimea, but then Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk. And I've always pretty much said that was pretty much the minimum of what they were going for in all of this. But I would definitely say that as someone who, I'm American, so whatever, but Dmitry would agree as a Russian nationalist, that would definitely be at best, a Pyrrhic victory. That's not what anybody who thought this thing would have maybe gone 6 months, now that it's gone years and years, and that's what we get. I don't know, there were billboards saying, Odessa, we're going to come for you, all these things. Is that really what's going to happen? And I think, unfortunately, Putin, if the West really took it, he would take what I just described, that deal, which would be unfortunate. But, and this is just from where's the post right here? This is from the Deputy Speaker of the State Duma of Russia, Pyotr Tolstoy. He said, "This is the last peace proposal from our side. The next one will be a proposal for Ukraine's surrender." So again, the Russians are unfortunately a little bit too obsessed with international law, legitimacy, all of these sorts of ideas, because they fear the military superiority of the collective West. They realize that they have still the collective mandate on anything close to a global monopoly on violence. Obviously, in each state, the government has to find its legitimacy, but the U.S. has managed to convince enough of the world that it's a legitimate and righteous enough state where it can act as a global policeman. The Russians are afraid of that because they know that the Americans, if it was just a one-on-one with America and Russia, I mean, we know how that was probably going to go, at least in the past 10 years recently. Things may have shifted with some of the rot that we see in the US, but I think the fact that that is going to get rejected, that proposal is, for better or for worse, Putin. I've always said that circumstances are going to force Putin and the Russians to do the more based thing. I've said this a lot, that if these things happen, it's not going to be because the people are necessarily, based or they're, good or everything. I think, for lack of a better way to say it, I mean, the Holy Spirit might, make things happen the way that they need to happen. And I think that at the end of all of this, come 2025, 2026, when at least the Russians are going to try to scale down the Ukrainian operation, unless it gets totally connected with all of these other fronts, which I think it totally could do. I think at the end of it all, I think most of the Black Sea, if not all of the Black Sea coast, is going to end up in Russian hands, or at least perhaps when Turkey gets involved, that will be when that totally comes in. But I think when this is all said and done, or when this thing finally dies down in any kind of capacity, more of Ukraine than just those provinces is going to be taken. I think up to the Dnieper River, plus most of that coastline. I've been saying that for a long time, but whether that happens at the end of this current Ukrainian regime, whether that happens when World War III expands, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's generally the direction that all of this is headed as far as on the ground in Ukraine goes.
Yeah, I pretty much share both your guys' sympathies. So sounds like we're all on the same wavelength and expecting very similar outcomes. Again, really appreciate you guys coming on. We got many questions to dive into. I'll start with the Dunno chats. So we had first one comes in from John Anon, throws in $5, says, what are your thoughts about Moscow as the third Rome and the concept of Catehan, aka Restrainer of the Antichrist? ? Either one of you guys want to take that?
Yeah, I'll just briefly answer that. I think Moscow, the third Rome concept is no longer theoretical. I think it was a practical thing that came to be after 1453, actually, during the reign of Basil II. That is Basil the Dark, as they call him, the blind Orthodox Prince of Rus, who led, mind you, and this is the Russian chroniclers, they describe him. Imagine, he was blinded by his political opponents, Game of Thrones style, but he was physically blind, but spiritually was so aware that he did not take on the Uniate Catholic, communion there. So he's a very interesting figure, which is underappreciated. I haven't written about him yet, but I think in the future we will deep dive into Basil II of Rus. Very, very interesting prince. But his grandson became the first Tsar of Russia, Ivan Grozny, of course, and his great-grandson, that is. And of course, you have Russia emerging as the third Rome. I think most of us have heard about this concept, but what gives this concept legitimacy, and just briefly, because there's a lot of questions, is the sermon of Saint John of Shanghai and San Francisco, who we all hold in such high regard, especially. He called Russia the third Rome in, I believe, at least 2 of his sermons, which are published online. One of them was during the day of, I believe it was 17th or 18th of July, in the memory of the Romanovs. He begins speaking about Russian history, and he calls Russia the third Rome explicitly in Russian, and I think it's translated into English. So that's quite clear. I agree with St. John. And of course, the idea that the Cathechesis, I think that's very clear from our great saint, who is the sort of he assisted in formatting the liturgy, St. John Chrysostom. His interpretation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 6, and the discussion of the Cathechesis, the Restrainer. He calls the Restrainer the Roman Empire. And of course, other saints. Well, he states it is the state and the imperial authority. In church texts, in the canons, imperial authority means emperor, the person, the subject, the Tsar, the emperor. These Caesar. These words are essentially synonymous. And Saint Theophan, the new recluse, Saint John of Shanghai, San Francisco, Saint Seraphim Sobolev. All the saints of the church after St. John Chrysostom, most of them agreed with that interpretation of 2 Thessalonians. It is the dominant patristic view. I know there are other opinions on 2 Thessalonians 2:6. They can also coexist. In fact, there could be like a multitude of, they could all be right in a certain way, but this one was the dominant view. So that's the answer for the Cathechesis question.
Excellent. John Anon throws in another $5, and I think I know where he's going with this. So play friendly on YouTube. He says, between Britain, Israel, and the USA, who controls who and who controls the controllers?
Well, to find out who rules over you, find out who you are not allowed to criticize. So
I think
you all know what I can't say right now. So
yeah, exactly.
I was just going to briefly add, I could connect these two questions just in a brief aside. Dmitry talked about, the Cathechesis, and I think this is an idea, obviously that, was started with, in the New Testament. And I think Constantine finally, with becoming the Christian emperor, became the first restrainer of the Antichrist in this kind of imperial Christian way. And that ultimately then, Constantinople was the second Rome. And then, as Dmitry just explained, the transition between, second Rome to third Rome. And the prophecy that I mentioned before about the king from Byzantium supposedly coming and ruling from Moscow, this is this comes into play with the question that John just asked, because all of these connections, whether it's the Turkish thing that we've been talking about or this Greek Byzantine king that's going to come and rule, there's this sort of alliance that I've always discussed of the Anglo Empire, then the Ottomans, and then ultimately, the Zionists and the Jews. And this sort of trifecta have for hundreds of years now, especially in even the very, very beginning of the modern age, have been explicitly uniting in a political fashion, against orthodoxy. They're the reason, as Dmitry had explained before, of all these czars have had plans to take Tsargrad, Constantinople, but somehow, the British Empire and the Ottomans and then the merchants all around us end up all uniting against that. We, of course, know who opened the gates of the door in Constantinople. We, of course, also know that there's even the talk of the whole new heavenly Jerusalem thing, which I think you've maybe mentioned on the channel before, Patrick. This is a reality that there's still always the chance that we know that in Russia and Ukraine there are, Israeli dual citizens that have high-ranking authority on both sides. There's always the fear that, there's always the dialectic of just war profiteering from debt and money, but then there's the fact that what if this territory is being cleared for more nefarious purposes? But I think you look into that specific angle as well, and St. John Vatatzis, the Marble King himself, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in part 2, but in part 1 we talk about how whether it was the Muslims or whether it was, the Talmudists or whether it was the Uniate attempts and these merchants and these Venetians and Genoese, the true righteous emperor was able to rise above that, have an autarkic, sovereign state, preserve orthodoxy, and ultimately they were able to retake Constantinople for 200 plus years. And I think that really has to do with what we're seeing right now. The emperor was killed. It was brutal. The 1500 years of Christian imperium and the spread of the gospel in its apostolic form was kind of ended in that regard. But now 100 years later, perhaps there's a chance that we'll get this chance to restorm the gates of the third Rome of Moscow for a second. And I think even a similar timeline, maybe 200 years and then it's Antichrist time. Maybe 20 years or a generation or 2 generations or however long it is. But I think that's how some of that might end up going down.
Yeah. And as the saints and elders have prophesied, there will be this golden age of orthodoxy. So there is light on the other side of the Great World War tunnel. And then obviously, I think a lot of people, and again, refer back to my stream with Father Peter Hears, I think just a lot of people have these Protestant understandings of like an apocalyptic timeline. They think it's all going to transpire in like a couple of days or so. This is a long, drawn-out process. So next one comes from Blue Skittle, throws in $2, just says crazy times. Crazy times indeed. Thank you very much, Blue Skittle. And then over on Streamlabs, I know we got multiple questions over here. Let me find the first one. Comes from, so BMX 1966 throws in $10, no question. Thank you very much, BMX 1966. USA Motorcycle says Zionists are Sabbateans. Follow Little Stash. Who will protect Levantine Christians and the People's Republic of Donetsk? Did you guys hear a question there? Who will protect the Levantine Christians and the People's Republic of Donetsk?
Well, I think the Russian Federation is trying to do that with its expedition in Syria. It's trying to protect the Levant, literally, like physically, from both ISIS and hopefully from
Right.
Zionist bombardment of the Syrian Assad regime, who is of course pro Church of Antioch, to which the two of you belong, coincidentally, the archdiocese in America. And we know the Assad regime has assisted Orthodox Christianity in Syria, and that's
Right.
of course when you see Russia assisting them, we see Russia protecting Donetsk from bombardment by the SBU. So I mean, it's almost as if both of these countries are fighting against enemies which are related. Yep.
Right. And according to the prophecies, Russia will make their way all the way down to the holy city of Jerusalem. So,
Amen.
yep. Okay, next question. General Milley throws in $3, says, what do these guys think of, and pardon me, I don't speak Russian, Zyuganov? Does that sound?
Zyuganov, the head of the
Zyuganov,
Communist
yes,
Party
yes.
of Russia. I think he claims to be an Orthodox Christian, and again, it's rude to criticize another brother's faith. But I'll just say that, remember when we spoke about Putin's catechism?
Right.
Yeah, minus 50% off of that, and add on Marxist delusions of a Hinkelite level, Jackson Hinkle level, that is Zyuganov. So completely, this guy is what you'd call the swamp of Russian politics. He's a loser. He's what you'd call a political cuck who doesn't even stand for his own Marxist principles. And there's nothing good to say about this character. He's not a genuine person. He would need to go into retirement. The fact that he's over 80, and he lost a very close election against Boris Yeltsin in 1996 because the oligarchs they've now admitted it. They openly rigged the Russian election in 96 because communism, again, after the shenanigans of the early 90s, obviously communism became popular again in Russia because they were like, hold up, what is this crazy oligarch shenanigans happening? The country's falling apart. Capitalism doesn't work. Let's go back. And Zyuganov was the runner-up. He was actually in the presidential race. And,
Wow.
the election was stolen in 96. And now they admitted that they stole it. So communism should have technically, well, at least the Communist Party should have returned to power in its Russian Federation form in 96. So Zyuganov's salty about that. But since then, he's only deteriorated both ideologically, living in this weird schizophrenia, Marxism meets orthodoxy, Jackson Hinkle world, as well as I would say mentally too. Like I think he's in the Joe Biden dementia stage. No offense to him. So nothing really good to say about Zyuganov, but I think he's a bit of a clown.
Thank you. Next one comes from Frankie D. Shout out to our brother Frankie D. Throws in $10. Says, bro, I've been struggling with this. I do not want to fight for what I perceive to be an enemy of Orthodox people, yet even if I get out of the military, I will likely be recalled in the event of a major mobilization. God have mercy. I don't know what to do. Well, Frankie D, I'll say a prayer for you. That is a difficult situation, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I agree. I wouldn't want to die for the military industrial complex either. Frankie D throws in another $5, says it's crazy. I see the recent Trump conviction, the Alex Jones takedown, the warrant for Steve Bannon as being connected. Well, they absolutely are connected. It's about silencing any populist movement here in the U.S. They are coming for opposition. They are preparing for wartime censorship and crushing opposition representatives / voices. I agree with that. I think that's quite clear in regards to everything going on right now. Thank you again, Frankie D, for the support. Fran throws in $5, says, I thought the same thing, bro. I heard that prophecy of the coast suffering terribly, and I immediately thought of the Cascade Fault Line that could totally wipe out Seattle with all of the economy of Western Washington. Suffering indeed. Glory to Russia, boys. Thank you, Fran. Frankie D threw in another one and said, can you explain God allowing these great wars to sober the people? I have my own internal pushback on that. It's my observation that the last two wars were catalysts to make our world what it is today. So I fear World War III leading to the victory of evil for now. I'll make a quick comment, then you guys can say whatever you want. But if you listen to Metropolitan Neophytos or any of the elders, it's all about calling people to repentance. So evil can't fully win, and the rise of anything that you might perceive as evil or winning, as Dmitry said, Orthodoxy is the fastest growing religion in the West. And I don't think that's a coincidence with the fact that also the evils and the degeneracy of the West is on the rise. So I see that as providence. I don't see that as God not acting in history. But do you guys have a comment on on his general thought that God allows these wars to sober people?
Yeah, I think obviously God allowed the First and Second World War to happen, whether we like what happened afterwards or not. So there's that. But I think, I mean, even in the prophecies, I mean, even when it gets better, it'll be very brief compared to, eternity, even I think possibly even the time when it gets really bad. I mean, the brief time where we don't even know the extent of the tribulations or however hard it might be for the people and everything. Again, we just got done with the vaccination, which was clearly a type of the mark and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that was tough for some people. So and it's just exponential. I think there could be 3 or 4 more types before we even get to the final one based on that same pattern. So you got to always be watching out for that. But I mean, most people, like as far as the COVID kind of thing goes, I think they'd have a hard time in the next generation doing the biomedical tyranny lockdown again. I think that would be a pretty tough offer. So I've always been skeptical of somehow the UFO Project Blue Beam psyop coming down in the midst of the World War III. The World War III be like the concept, like the issue going on Earth, and then that is done as a sort of peacemaking kind of thing. There's also, of course, Frankie, you asked this question. He was mentioning the Trump ban thing. I'm not trying to get too conspiratorial here, but I'm pretty much convinced that the Zionists in America are going to rig this one for Trump, and it's going to line up right when Israel's in some deep doo-doo, and Trump's going to sweep in, and it's going to be some crazy Third Temple Zionist type stuff.
Yeah,
but we'll again. I'm not. I hope that doesn't happen. But I've mentioned in the past how, I mean, obviously, I don't know if Kushner is going to be involved again, but Trump, he gets this Torah crown from these societies.
Well, he has the Ark of the Covenant replica at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, I mean, he's supposedly about to get $100 million from Miriam Adelson, whose condition is West Bank annexation, which is like, I mean, that's all of East Jerusalem right there. So that's, I mean, Temple Mount. I mean, I don't even have to say it. So I mean, this is some big stuff. So I think that as far as being allowed to occur, obviously there's the whole situation in the U.S. and how it affects how this election may or may not affect what's going on overseas. And I think, both sides of the kosher sandwich have there's no escaping it. There's no anti-Zionist option. JFK Jr. is even more Zionist than like Trump or Biden. So like, the best we get is a Thomas Massey appearance on Tucker Carlson, but that's it's like your sovereignty, sir. And like, that's all we get. But I think that's a big concern that is going to happen. Is I believe that there are Zionist Talmudic forces that are playing both sides of all of these things, trying to orchestrate an outcome, establish a dialectic, and transcend it in a way that they find favorable. So there's always that, but God trumps all that nonsense anyway.
Dmitry, did you have anything you wanted to say on that topic?
Yeah, I think we just have to look at it from what we know about eschatological times at the end. God will permit even the Antichrist to come to power in the end,
right?
Because the evil will overflow the earth, and the tribe of Dan will bring their candidate, and he will reign in Jerusalem as high priest and king and whatnot, and there'll be a false prophet. But even there'll still be an opportunity for people, even of that tribe and various other tribes, and anyone who hasn't become Orthodox yet, to still convert, because Enoch and Elijah will return. And so this opportunity of sobering up, even during, we mentioned World War II, and even Tiny Mustache Man, besides, regardless of what else he did, he opened up just for political pragmatic reasons, opened 9,500 churches in the occupied USSR, which forced Stalin to open 2,500 churches and restore the Patriarchate. So even World War II, through God's providence, benefited the people who were living under, shall we say, Soviet or even post-World War I communist oppression. Notice how and people could attend church again, receive confession, communion, etc. The sacraments return to people's everyday lives. And so, it's not for us to know, frankly, how the Lord finds goodness and why. I mean, we know individually, but those of us with illnesses and sicknesses, we know Saint Nectarius of Egina, for example, the Lord permits for diseases to take place in humans. For example, Saint Nectarius had cancer, but he saw it as a blessing in order to bring himself to repentance. And to, saying sober and Saint Nectarius up is a bit of a stretch, because, I'm way beneath him on a worm-like level, but he saw it as a benefit. And Saint Paisios the same when he was ill. And I think collectively, that is what war is, both a symptom and a surgical operation of sorts on a spiritual level. And we humans, the only guidance we have is church tradition and actually attending church. We can't think on these massive scales, but we need to take them into consideration because that's what was revealed to us.
Right. Well said. Next super chat comes from Jacob, throws in $1, says, St. Justin Popovich, please pray for us. Amen. General Milley throws in $3 and says, Zelensky pins medals on the men his grandpa fought. And over on YouTube, special thank you to Logan Daly for gifting 5 COTEL Crew memberships. Thank you very much, brother. Truly appreciate all your support. Chase Haggard said, where can I buy Conrad and Dmitriy's physiognomy? Mud, COTEL Crew member for 15 months, said, my entire life I considered the Russian people my brothers purely because I live in northern Wisconsin and related to their suffering in winter. Funny. Thank you, Mud. Really appreciate your support. The next one, I think, comes from somebody who's maybe critical of you guys. I will bring the super chat up, but he says, questions for the guests. Were you previously advocating ethnic superiority or dominance for a specific race in this country? I don't know which country he's referring to. I vehemently oppose such views. Immigrants are the backbone of this nation. So I guess he's talking about America.
Yeah. I assume it was America. Yeah. I mean, the last comment made me think this might be bait, but I'm thinking,
I don't know who this person is. They were gifted a membership here, but
they gave $10.
I don't know why this has anything to pertain to today's conversation. So if you want to skip that, feel free.
I mean, I was just gonna say, I mean, I'm a heritage American. My ancestors go back pretty far.
Same.
If you're somebody that came over that far back, and there's no like exclusivity to people like us calling ourselves American, I would throw that back as that's supremacist against me, because like, what am I like? If everyone can just become what I am, then I'm like nothing. So what is somebody whose ancestors go back to the 1600s in America that have had ethnogenesis occur, that they have some Germanic ancestry now based on the other circumstances, they have a strongly American non-Anglo accent? Like, what does that mean? Because if that's just something that anybody can like adopt into, that's not really true. So yeah, I do affirm that there's an ethnic nature to being a heritage American. That doesn't mean that there's not. That doesn't mean I'm saying Italians or Greeks or anybody else, they don't become American, but they are assimilating into an Anglo-Saxon American society, right? Like that's just kind of what's happening. So, you know, people can have a problem with that, but that's just, I don't think that's even
pretty logical to me. I want to live in a world where Japan is for Japanese people, and you know,
just got back.
The Congos for Congolese people. Yeah. So I think it's many presuppositions are already laden the question itself, so we don't need to dive into that. I think anybody watching this stream probably shares our perspective. Brody Alexander throws in $2 and says, Ether Hour is fire. Sub up to World War Now, y'all. It's a gem. Guys, go subscribe to World War Now. The hyperlink is in the video title. Just click that. It'll take you straight to their channel. If not, just search World War Now and go subscribe. I know a handful of people already have. I've seen it in the comments. So go follow their work and their Substack, most importantly, which that link is in the video description. Rigovich throws in $2 and says, so we're all moving to Russia, Georgia. Not me. I'm dying right where I'm at. That's my providence. But if you feel so inclined. And then a very generous super chat from our buddy Alan Wong throws in $100. Thank you so much, Alan Wong. God bless you, brother. He said, blessed feast of the ascension to the Ortho Bros. Thank you very, very much, Alan Wong, for your generous support. God bless you.
Hero. We love
God bless you, Alan, and and enjoy coming Pentecost as well. Sorry, I just said, blessed feast day of ascension to you, Alan. Thank you for your support of Patrick and the show. It's really important that we keep supporting these Orthodox shows, especially while they're still allowed online and they're still available. It's a unique time, and it's great. And hope you have a nice Pentecost as well in a couple of weeks. So,
amen. Our Orthodox sister, fellow Hoosier, Slow Boy Whiteboard, been a COTEL Crew member for 15 months as well, says, thanks for having Conrad and Dmitriy on. Excellent stream. Absolutely. Thank you guys again for coming on and sharing your guys' insight. Fantastic stuff. Again, a major supporter of what you guys are doing. I think it's really important. And I think everybody listening now or in the future, go follow World War Now and support them and help them grow what it is that they're doing. I think it's really important. Rigovich throws in another $5, says, just bought the Romanov Royal Martyrs, What Silence Could Not Conceal. Any other books you could recommend on the Holy Martyrs? God bless you all. I think that's definitely for you two. Any thoughts? I think Dmitry, since he got a 20,000 word Substack on it, he's probably the man.
I was almost going to recommend subscribing to our Substack, because that article, but only, and as a disclaimer, only after you've actually read the book, because you purchased it now, but I know the book is several hundred pages long, so read through it. And if you feel like you want to investigate, say, their ritual murder a little bit more in depth, you could, of course, subscribe to the Substack, and we do have quite a thorough discussion of it from, again, an Orthodox perspective. The other great book, which I think was written and it's taken as a really good primary source, is the Prince Oldenburg book. I believe it's 3 tomes. It's quite dry, but if you really like that period, so I believe, I don't have the title of the book up, but it's like the life of Nicholas II and the last years of the Russian Orthodox Empire by Prince Oldenburg. It's a very well-known source. It's actually brought up in that book. You referenced the Romanov Royal Martyrs, What Silence Could Not Conceal. So I think that's, like, if you really want to get to the OG, 100-year-old books that actually cover the source material from a non-biased perspective, maybe, because there's a lot of really bad liberal and Marxist sources which discuss the Romanov family, which are complete garbage. Like, they're not even worth looking at, because they'll sort of taint your understanding of the period.
It looks like Rigovich said he's going to go subscribe. So do that. Get access to their Substack. Next one comes in from Matthias TM, says Constantinople has been infiltrated by Masons since Meletios Metaxas. I'm terrible with names, so forget me.
It's all Greek to me,
Yeah.
But yeah, Meletios Metaxakis, he was, I believe he was also a rabbi. So it's the fact that he was patriarch of Constantinople.
Interesting. Very interesting.
He was patriarch of Constantinople is scandalous just in and of itself. But him and Athenagoras, they set the stage. They set the stage for all of the terrible things we're seeing right now.
Right. Dmitry, you have anything you want to say on that?
Oh, there's so much. He's one of the most malicious characters in church history of the 20th century. Like, I don't think there's anyone worse than him. Even the weirdest people who promoted, say, Sergianism in the Russian Orthodox Church. Meletios Metaxakis, like, I'm not sure if he was a rabbi, potentially. Like, he definitely acts like one. So spiritually, he is definitely in that stream. But he was a Freemason, a Greek Freemason. He was the patriarch of multiple sees at different times. The laity didn't like him, so he was deposed, moved away from his seat. He had to shuffle around. He brought in, of course, the new calendar, which we know. Unfortunately, he's the guy who started all of that in the 1920s. He also supported the Bolshevik-created living church. The Bolshevik supported the schism, that church that was created and that no longer exists. It disappeared in the 1930s. But yeah, so he supported basically what we see in Ukraine now, like the proto-schism of that. And his colleague, unfortunately, was the Patriarch of Romania, Patriarch Miron, who was also the Prime Minister of Romania. And it's weird. It's like he was the Prime Minister and the Patriarch at the same time. And if you guys have read about Codreanu, when Codreanu was martyred, again, in a ritual type murder. And so he essentially, Patriarch Miron, who also brought in the new calendar in Romania, he unfortunately didn't comment on Codreanu's murder. If anything, he supported the people who murdered him. So very based. So exactly. So these two patriarchs are some of the troublemakers. And as Conrad said, between Meletios Metaxakis and Patriarch Athenagoras in the 1960s, Athenagoras was the Vatican II type. Like, he used to, I think he was even at Vatican II as like a special guest, like on the side watching it happen. These people are literally 60 years of ecumenical patriarchs who were absolutely horrible for the Greek Orthodox Church, first and foremost, but even for all of Orthodoxy, and they're probably even worse than Patriarch Bartholomew is today. And mind you, we don't even like being critical towards our own former hierarchs in the church. Like, we really don't like, but yeah, perhaps I'm, yeah, it's just really hard when you're really passionate about these sort of things not to speak your mind. But he's a very malicious character, this one, unfortunately.
Well, I have to look more into him. I'm not very familiar with him, so I appreciate your guys' insight. Next one, GSP throws in 279, says 2 amazing channels doing 1 stream. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, brother. This is you gave him a shout out, didn't you?
Well, he's the only person that's co-hosted World War Now besides either of us. So
damn.
He's done a show with me and he's done a show with Dmitry when either of us were indisposed. So
excellent. Well, shout out to GSP. God bless you, brother.
Yeah, subscribe to his channel. He does a show with Constantine Martelli called The War Report. It's a good show. It's like even more strictly just war analysis. Like GSP does great battlefield analysis for Ukraine. So
excellent.
That's on the YouTube channel Constantine Martelli if anyone wants to check it out.
And MyTech23 throws in $5, says, what do you think will happen to Zelensky? I think is what he's trying to say, after the war is done.
Well, I think Zelensky wants to retire. There's been a recent purchase of him of a massive hotel complex on Cyprus, of all places, Metropolitan Neophytos' home. I think he wants to retire very soon, just like his colleague Zaluzhny, the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces. But I think based on his conduct recently, and even the way he noticed the pride in which he speaks, even to other European leaders, these top-level Freemasons like Macron, he disrespects them openly because he thinks he is in the driver's seat. I think he's assuming too much of himself. So I think he will have quite a violent end in the end, even if his own people take him out, just like Berezovsky, the oligarch, was found hung by the neck from the, in London. They claimed the Russian FSB did it, but I think his own people, these people infight a lot, as we know from the communist Bolshevik Revolution. So I think now that they've used Zelensky, they're going to dispose of him like the garbage that he is, unfortunately. So unless he, of course, repents, which we always call Zelensky to actually repent and stop LARPing as whatever the character is playing at the moment. But again, his behavior doesn't lead us to those good conclusions.
Right. Naom Sane throws in $10, says, pray we all remove the diapers from our faces and blinders from our eyes. Meanwhile, his profile picture is literally a mask and one iPad. But thank you very much, Noam Sane. Definitely agree. Remove the face diapers and get closer to Christ so your eyes can actually open to what's going on. One of our brothers, Michael Sisko, throws in $5. Appreciate you, Michael Sisko. God bless you. And Logan Daly gifted another 5 COTEL Crew memberships. Thank you so much, Logan. Really appreciate all the support, brother. He's been an incredible supporter of the channel. Really appreciate you, Logan. God bless you, bro. And Michael sends in another $5, says, immigration is the backbone of dim boys supremacy. And yeah, agreed, except for their ethno state. So I get your point, Michael. Really appreciate it. And it's a good little rebuttal to the earlier criticism we had of our guest.
Hey, it's always more fun with a bit of, it's always more fun with a little bit of, if it's just people you agree with, it starts to get boring. So
true. Carson throws in $5 over on Dono Chat. Have you guys seen Nick Hinton's stuff? I think he'd be a great guest to have on regarding these topics. You guys know?
Yeah, we follow each other. Okay. We follow each other on X. I think he sent me a message
with who that is.
I think he's a fan of the show. He's like into some pretty mystical stuff. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but I can't remember if he's baptized or not yet, or if he's still a catechumen or something. So obviously we'd want to make sure that we wouldn't want to have anybody on talking about that kind of stuff if they're like a catechumen or anything like that. But no, we'd love to, maybe we should do an X space with him because we have a lot of people that have their biggest audiences on X. So if we wanted to get
that'd be a good idea.
Him and Dmitry should do an X space because they both have big X. We started the show and Dmitry has 6,000 followers. I had a little under 2,000 and I'm now barely at 6,000 and Dmitry's rocketed to over 80,000. So,
dang.
You got to help me out here. I've been left in the dust by my anonymous co-host.
My X is the worst platform for me. I'm so shadow banned. You cannot find my channel unless somebody you follow retweets or tweets my stuff. So yeah.
Well, this is my third. This is my third. I had 1 million anonymous accounts get banned, but if the same thing would have been true for me if I was still on my original Conrad account, but that got banned in 2021 after January 6th. So I'm on this new thing that now has become the best account I've ever had since Elon bought it. So
wow. Well, I had a account get banned from Twitter, and then I created a new account, and that was before Elon bought it. And I don't know if there was already restrictions on the account. Now I saw a uptick once Elon bought it, but then about a week after that, you know, my Twitter X sucks for me. So and I pay for the freaking premium thing. It drives me nuts sometimes when I think about it. But hopefully I can get in touch with somebody. Although I've tried, and you just get automated responses. You can't get a hold of anybody.
Yeah.
And I think the last super chat that came in is from Nikos. Throws in $10. Says, "Great stream. Awesome to see War Now. Everyone needs to subscribe to their Substack." Agreed. Could we possibly get Anthony of Westgate on COTEL to discuss alchemy, magic, and Kabbalah? Do you guys know who Anthony of Westgate is?
Couldn't recommend him more. He's one of our best. He's one of my favorite guys. He's also got a great X account, but he's been on our show probably 3 times. Let
me pull it
He's
up.
a great. You would love his article, Patrick. You would love. He has an article called "The Occult Roots of Modern Cosmology," and he talks about Copernicus, heliocentrism, that kind of stuff. But he's also really
nice.
It's really he's a good. He's great.
Yeah, I'll reach out to him.
There's a Substack called The Reversion. You should look into. You'd really like it. Yeah,
I just followed him on X, so I'll try to reach out to him. I appreciate you guys referring new people. I really don't consume a whole lot of content. I kind of just, do my own thing once I don't go live. So I appreciate you guys giving me some new people to contact and new content to look into. So yeah, I think that does all of them. Guys, is there anything else that you want to promote or shout out? Oh, okay. We just got another one that came in. Looks like Serbian Prevlas. I don't know. Throws in $10. Dmitry, that first part's for you, brother.
All right.
I just joined this stream. Who are these false patriarchs you guys speak about so I can write their names down? You guys,
well, look,
go ahead.
I think if you're speaking about historically, I think it's worth looking into the position on not just the new calendar, but also the living church schism that took place in the Bolshevik period, which patriarchs supported it between the 1920s and the 1940s from the church. Just worth investigating, and for yourself even, it may be interesting, because I think even the English-speaking internet would have material on that. But specifically, Meletios Metaxakis, you'll probably see his name if you scroll up in the YouTube live chat, because the alert comes up, or maybe it was Streamlabs. But Meletios Metaxakis, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and his name just came up on screen, as well as Patriarch Myron Christia, and that's with a C. And he was also the prime minister of Romania. Very shady characters. Like, this is again with the whole Codriano thing, throwing Codriano's movement under the bus specifically. Right. Allegedly he was a member of this is again before the Orthodox Church publicly denounced Freemasonry officially. So even anathemas of Freemasonry only started coming in a little bit later on in the 20th century. So these guys kind of got in before they were, say, formally excluded from the church. So yes, there was an attempted subversion of Orthodoxy, or at least certain jurisdictions, by Freemasons, especially at the helm. And again, Patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople, like this guy is absolutely Vatican II level.
Yeah,
so hopefully that answers your question.
The article "CIA's Man in Constantinople" begins talking about Athenagoras and his relationship to the OSS.
Crazy.
And one more just came in. It's from General Milley again. Thank you so much, General Milley. He says, and this is a name again I'm not familiar with, so let me know if you guys know of him. Robert Sungenis is Catholic but based, he said.
Robert Sungenis. He's a Catholic geocentrist. He made the movie The Principle with Wolfgang Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with Wolfgang Smith. I tell everybody to read Cosmos and Transcendence. It was probably it's probably the most important non-Orthodox book I've ever read in my entire life.
Let me pull it up. What's that book again?
Cosmos and Transcendence, Breaking Through the Barrier of Scientific Belief.
Oh, okay.
It's a tough read, especially if you're not a STEM person, which I'm not. It's like he's like an MIT mathematician. It's like you're going to have to pull out your dictionary when you read this thing. But like, if you struggle with like, you know, I know people that like, they're into like alternative cosmology, they're into miracles and Christianity and mysticism, but they still have like really crazy naturalistic, you know, post-enlightenment presuppositions about the nature of the universe. Read this book and it pretty much puts those to rest. It's 6 chapters. And in my opinion, how I think of it is the book just refutes Copernicus, Newton, Einstein, Jung, I'm forgetting some of the rest, but it's like 6 of just like the major thinkers of the modern kind of worldview. And Syngenes is a Catholic who he's like a geocentrist. He's written about this as well. But Cosmos and Transcendence is where I tell people to go a lot.
Is Wolfgang Orthodox?
He's Catholic as well.
He's Catholic. Okay. All right. Well, I got that book. I'll get a copy. Appreciate that. Totally. All right. Well, I think that does it. Let me just double check, make sure everybody. Yep. Okay. Gentlemen, anything else you want to promote or tell people to do? Again, go subscribe to their Substack. Go follow their YouTube channel. Anything you guys want to say before we hop off here?
Yeah, just worldwarnow.co. I'm on Twitter at GnomeRad, and we're on Twitter again, worldwarnow_.
Yeah, let me pull that up again.
Yeah, and yeah, Twitter is a good place to connect to us if you want to shoot us a message, if you want to help out with the show. We always are looking for clippers. Yeah. So if you listen to the show and like the show, please clip the show, add some subtitles or something. We will share that around. We have an account called World War Now Clips. If you send me good clips, I will post them on that account. So
I just posted Dmitri's X handle. And then here is World War Now's, or I guess the links. There are links to the accounts. This one's to World War Now, and then let me grab. There's Conrad. Let me grab his and put it in the chat as well, because people can click the hyperlinks when the stream's over.
Totally, yeah, I appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, that's where you find all of our stuff. You know, if anyone stuck around to the end of the stream or the video, I'll give you a bonus. You can read the full ritual regicide article that Dmitry wrote on unsreview.com. I don't know if it's up yet, but it will be at some point. But Easter egg for people that listen to the end. But we still want you to subscribe on Substack, get access. Again, we've got over 40 episodes of Ether Hour, where sure, for free you get like 10 to maybe 30 minutes sometimes of the free preview, but most of them are well over an hour long, and you get access to the full show. So subscribing there really helps us out. And it's some interesting stuff. It's about St. John Vitatsis with Gregory Hears. We've got the FBI and their, you know, subversion of orthodoxy in America with Father John Whiteford. We've got, this one's fully for free, but we have Abbot Trifon in what is the longest piece of media that exists about his spiritual father, Elder Dmitry of Santa Rosa. We have that on our channel as well. It's fully for free for anybody that wants to listen. So if you support all of that, it really helps us to get behind the paywall. So thank you so much, Patrick, for having us on. And thank you for the loving reception from the audience.
Of course. And a major shout out again to Logan Daly. He just gifted another 5 COTEL Crew memberships. Thank you so much, Logan. God bless you, brother. Really, really appreciate all the support. You're the man. And so that's going to do it. Guys, smash that like. And again, make sure you go follow the World War Now guys and support them. Get yourself a paid membership so you guys can get behind that paywall and get access to all their content. They're doing great work. And let me know, guys, if there's anything I can do to promote your guys' stuff or give you more. Again, I'm terrible on X, so my account's not going to help you much on X. Dimitri's going to get a lot more visibility than I do. But any articles or any videos you guys post, let me know, and I'll try to share them around and get more eyeballs on what you guys are doing.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Man. Yeah, we'll continue to work. Yeah, let's work together and keep this thing going. And thank you for the stream. It's been so awesome, such a good discussion. And thank you for the listeners, the commenters. Like, reading the comments is really fascinating. I love live streams are really next level. We don't do them very often with Conrad, but they're so good. So thank you, Patrick.
Of course. Again, thank you guys, and wish you all a blessed weekend. And we need to do another one again. So I'm sure let the world burn a little bit more for the next few months, and then we'll have plenty of fodder to discuss in another one. So thank you guys so much. Dmitry, really appreciate how articulate and insightful you are on everything. And Conrad, appreciate you as well, man. God bless both of you guys and everything you're doing. And Logan Daly throws in another $5. He says, renew your dang memberships. DPH's content is worth the $5 a month. Well, thank you so much, Logan. Really appreciate you, man. God bless you, bro. Thank you. And with that being said, we are going to hop off here, and I will see you guys tomorrow with Dr. Michael Moeller. And as always, until next time, God bless.
God bless everybody.